Chapter 901. The Suspicious Student, Part 1. Northern frowned as he took a seat beside Ellis. The instructors had gone to great lengths to secure this seat. They'd first approached the previous occupant with careful persuasion. Though initially reluctant, the student changed his mind upon learning who would take his place. He yielded without further protest. Northern had leveraged his growing reputation to make this demand. Yet now he sat grimacing as if someone had forced him there against his will. An awkward silence hung in the air for several seconds as he settled into the seat. Gazes from around the arena fixed on him, some filled with delight, others with fear, envy, or respect. The attention prickled at Northern's skin until the teams of new participants began filing into the arena, drawing eyes away from him. Northern shifted his focus to the incoming participants. The white-haired student president strode in, a massive warhammer strapped to her back. Something about the weapon tugged at Northern's memory. He squinted, studying it for several heartbeats before his eyes widened in recognition. What? Isn't that the hammer I forged? Indeed it was. Elena had given him that mineral intending for a sword, but Northern had crafted a warhammer instead, sensing it would better channel the essence of the rift mineral, the Ethereum. Northern stared, momentarily speechless. A boy with auburn hair followed, then a girl whose crimson hair flowed like liquid fire behind her. He recognized her from his first encounter with the council president. So, how have you been these past few months? Ellis ventured. Northern shrugged. It's only been 3 months, but I've been good. Busy. Ellis smiled and looked toward the stage. We can certainly see that. Northern glanced at Helena, who sat in unusual silence. The Helena he'd known would have jumped into the conversation by now. People change in 3 months too, I suppose. He turned his attention back to the stage. Both teams now stood ready, and the first round of fighters climbed onto the platform. Northern hadn't paid much attention to other combats, but one particular story had reached his ears despite his disinterest. He wasn't the only rising star among the students. Another fighter had emerged from the shadows, this one shrouded in mystery. All anyone knew was that he belonged to the combat school and wielded a dark, formidable ability. His fighting skills were remarkable too. Northern's meteoric rise had overshadowed the strangers, but the mysterious student possessed immense power. He and his team had defeated every team from the student council. No one had expected an ordinary team to battle their way to the finals. But it wasn't that news that captured Northern's interest in their battle. It was one particular member of that team. Just one. Mrs. Lackey, the red-haired woman with a puffy ego, stood in the center of the arena. She wielded twin stilettos, her armor sleek and fitted, a crimson and silver blend that glittered blindingly in the soft morning sunlight. As the examiner signaled the start of the battle, she crossed her arms over each other, leaned forward, and dove in for the kill. Her opponent was a timid boy with freckles dusting his cheeks and large green eyes. But those eyes seemed dark and lifeless, like abandoned wells. That detail unsettled Northern deeply, but he continued to watch. As the woman flowed toward him, the boy stood motionless. She closed the distance until her weapon curved a deadly arc aimed to slice into his neck from the side. Suddenly, he dropped to a low crouch. A sword materialized in his hands, completing its formation just as his arm blurred forward. The girl, quick-witted, leapt backward immediately, her face draining of color, confusion flashing across her features. The boy with the dull, lifeless expression stared at his sword, which had thrust through empty air and barely scraped her armor, with complete indifference. Just as she landed, he vanished, surging forward with speed. Having barely found her footing, the girl threw her hands up to block his first strike. The sound of their metals clashing rang out like a metal barrel exploding. Her eyes widened at the raw power behind his strikes. Like a mechanical, emotionless warrior, he was already tracing another attack from above. The girl deflected it again, directing his momentum outside her defensive zone to create space for a counter. But the boy's fist dove forward, smashing into her armor with thunderous force. Air blasted from her lungs, Her stomach seemed to collapse from within, and blood trickled down her lips. She frowned and thrust her blade toward the boy's exposed chest. But he vanished, leaping skyward and landing far from her reach. A crimson aura blazed on her daggers. Her legs staggered, but she refused to fall. The blood that had trickled onto the ground began to spread, and from each droplet, red vines emerged. The vines rose like thorny serpents, dancing around her in hypnotic patterns. She lashed her hands backward, and the thorny vines shot forward with blinding speed. The ground shuddered, then suddenly began to rise, moving in quick succession, like someone flipping a bedsheet from one end to the other. The entire arena floor tore apart, disrupting both the incoming vines and the girl who was barely keeping her footing. But the vines merely wiggled, curved higher into the sky, and hurtled toward the boy. He dove forward to intercept them, swinging his sword at the nearest vine. The blade sliced through easily, but as it did, the vine liquefied only to solidify again once the sword passed. Their lunge continued unhindered. They lashed onto the boy's hand and throat, snapping his arm against his shoulder. No matter how he struggled, breaking free proved impossible. The remaining vines twisted viciously toward him, maneuvering through the distorted landscape. Spikes carved from the arena concrete shot up to intercept them, but the blood vines were too unpredictable, too fluid. The girl was no longer where she'd stood moments before. She materialized behind the boy, one weapon carving a crude arc from the side while the other spun in a reverse hold, ready for a counter or follow-up strike. Northern completed his analysis without using Chaos Eyes, of course. He shifted his gaze to the black-haired boy standing outside the arena, waiting for his turn. Then he scratched his head with visible unease. Ellis glanced his way, not wanting to fully miss the action. "Are you all right?" Northern waved dismissively. "Don't worry about it. Just a very suspicious person bothering me." Chapter 902. The Suspicious Student, Part 2. As the girl drove in her dagger, it hung a mere breath away from the boy's skin, yet his face remained as dull and indifferent as stone. Her confidence wavered mid-strike, a tremor of doubt rippling through her arm. But alas, the blade connected. At least she thought so, until the ground suddenly shifted beneath her feet, and she found herself slashing at empty air. The boy stood far across from her, untouched. The arena had stretched like taffy, carrying her away from the lifeless figure. Northern, who had been scratching his head after his last sentence, froze and leaned forward with eyes wide as dinner plates. Pure excitement coursed through him as he slammed his hands against the edges of the demarcation, gripping the concrete so tightly it groaned beneath his weakened strength. What in the world? The ground expanded. He'd never seen anything like it. The boy's talent? Definitely elemental, earth elemental to be precise. Northern wasn't collecting all the elemental types, at least not intentionally. But he already possessed ice, fire, and wind. He had never encountered someone with earth-type elemental talent, while water types proved even rarer. In the Central Plains, fire and ice talents sprouted like weeds, especially fire. Few clans could boast ice talents at all, and they probably traced their lineage to the northern continent. Northern had begun to suspect that the talents found in the Central Plains might be tied to the region's weather, a wild speculation considering he'd never set foot there. But everyone knew the truth. Temperatures there plunged 100 times colder than the harshest winter day in the Central Plains. His eyes glittered like a child unwrapping his favorite toy on festival day. Ellis watched him with peculiar fascination. One minute, Northern discussed a suspicious student. The next, he vibrated with such excitement his bones might leap from his skin. Ellis remained silent for several seconds, blinking at Northern from the side. Then he remembered those early days, how spontaneous, unreasonable, and delightfully weird Northern could be. He scoffed pleasantly. "Of course." Northern sat back down, raising an eyebrow as he turned to Ellis. "What?" Ellis shook his head, still smiling. "Nothing at all. It's just good to know that even after whatever that has happened these past 3 months, you're still the very Northern I know. The one I fell in love with." Northern's glare could have frozen lava. Pardon. Ellis's grin widened into something predatory as he fixed Northern with a seductive stare, winking deliberately. Goosebumps erupted across Northern's skin like a plague of insects. He nearly shrank into himself, silently turning away to focus on the continuing match. Regardless of the suddenly extended ground, the girl had already flashed across, hurling a spiraling cyclone of dagger strikes at the boy. While Northern was distracted, the boy had switched his sword to his other hand, his blade blurring as he viciously parried each of the girl's persistent strikes. Not just with his sword. His entire body moved in sync, legs stepping back, sometimes sideways, all working in perfect tandem to exploit momentum shifts. One moment he'd shove her aside, the next he'd lure her in for a knee bash. But the girl's blood-thorn vines proved to be true thorns in his flesh. Their volatility restricted him in more ways than one. Yet somehow, he remained perpetually one step away from being hit, even when she was certain her weapon would finally make its mark. Her frustration bloomed like a poisonous flower. Her speed declined, the blood-thorn vines following suit. While it appeared she had the upper hand, her speed superior, bombarding the dull student with strikes from all sides, the truth painted a different picture. She had failed to land a single hit since the match began. Instead, she had suffered one herself. Worse, her attempts to strike him consumed more stamina and soul essence than his simple parries and counters. Was he even exerting himself? The boy's face remained impassive throughout, an unreadable mask. The lady staggered, barely standing. Her chest heaved with exhaustion, and more blood dripped from her nose. Yet her eyes blazed with a bloodshot fury that refused to yield. Northern folded his arms and leaned back. "This is foolish. I knew she was the reckless type." Ellis observed him without turning his head. "Are you worried about her?" Northern's eyebrow shot up in absurdity. "Why would I be worried about her? It's not her I'm concerned about. It's everyone." Ellis finally turned to face Northern, regarding him evenly. His once innocent face had gained a measure of maturity, appearing less frail and more defined, though still far from manhood. They were still teenagers, after all. "Does it have something to do with this suspicious student? Do you want to talk about it?" Northern stared at the match, squinting as the lady shot forward again. She took a swift dive, blurring forward while simultaneously driving her blood-thorn vines to lash at the boy. Stone walls rose like parchment pages, each blocking her path. The boy used them as stepping stones, vaulting over her to land far beyond her reach. Then the ground contracted once more, his sword slicing forward with deadly precision. The girl barely managed to roll away. The blade grazed her armor, drawing a thin line of blood from her exposed flesh. Exhaustion was claiming her now, its weight dragging at her movements like chains. Northern glanced at the student in black, scrutinizing him more intently. The boy possessed long black hair, neatly groomed and flowing to his shoulders like liquid night. His face pale as moonlight, eyes pitch-black pools of emptiness. Dismissive indifference hung about him like a cloak. No other emotion betrayed itself on those ghostly features. He stood with both hands clasped behind his back, one hand making minimal movements with two fingers extended. Northern's frown carved deep shadows across his face. Who really is this bastard? What exactly was happening? No matter how he examined it, this figure was no student. Nothing about him fit the mold. True, Northern hadn't met every student at Milgard Academy. But after 3 months here, he knew their essence, their bearing. The subtle air that marked them as belonging. It was simple to tell when someone didn't fit. When someone screamed, "This person doesn't belong here." Northern was certain other students sensed it too. Perhaps they simply didn't care enough to pursue it. And the instructors? Surely they would have intervened. Perhaps their inaction meant nothing was wrong. Northern might have accepted that explanation in calmer times, if he hadn't witnessed a grown intellect-gatherer suffer brainwashing without even realizing it. He had to factor that possibility into his calculations. All right then. Northern exhaled and decided to look at him. However, target profile unavailable. Target's soul is sealed with a strange anti-clairvoyance divination technique. Northern's frown deepened until it seemed to carve valleys into his face. Shadow claimed his features despite the morning's brilliance. At that precise moment, the suspicious student shifted his gaze. Eyes locking directly onto Northern, his expression cold. Then one corner of his lips slowly curled upward in a predatory grin. Chapter 903, Retaliation. Northern's eyes narrowed into a scowl. Did that bastard just grin at me? He did. That bastard grinned. Just like the first time Northern had laid eyes on him, the guy kept staring directly at Northern, for no discernible reason. Could he be someone I humiliated in the past? Northern wasn't sure about a lot of things, but one fact remained constant. He hadn't made many human enemies, not even in the Dark Continent. Monsters, on the other hand, were a different matter. Still, something about this was off. Entirely off. Northern studied the guy as he finally averted his gaze. Meanwhile, the fight unfolding below was reaching its climax. The dull-eyed, seemingly lifeless boy had erupted into a devastating flurry of movement. Encasing himself in earthen armor, he charged the girl relentlessly, crashing into her over and over with brute, unforgiving force. Her bloodied vines were utterly ineffective, breaking apart on impact. Then, with one final, thunderous bash, she was hurled into the air. But before she could hit the ground, someone leapt up and caught her mid-air, descending in a smooth arc with the grace of the wind itself. Northern's gaze flicked to the boy now cradling the girl in his arms. He had a stern look in his eyes, cold, disciplined. Northern didn't know the student council vice president well. In fact, he barely knew any of the council members. But from what little he'd seen, the guy had always been smiling, approachable, pleasant. Now, though he was anything but, his aura had shifted. His heterochromia eyes shimmered faintly, one flecked with frost, the other with steel. Both carried a dangerous calm. The dull student remained motionless in his stone shell, impassive, even as the vice president landed and gently set the girl down. Moments later, the examiner and medics rushed in. They whisked her away, and the match was declared over. A new one was already beginning. The next two contestants stood at opposite ends of the stage, glaring coldly at one another. The vice president's stare was razor-edged, frozen solid. The other student's expression, by contrast, was blank, detached, devoid of anything human. Ellis, who'd been watching Northern out of the corner of his eye, finally turned away. Northern hadn't answered the question Ellis had asked earlier. He'd been too deep in thought. Yet Ellis didn't press. He looked distracted too. So Northern let it go, shifting his attention to the new duel. They moved at once. One fighter darted forward with fluid elegance, as if wind itself carried him. The other thundered ahead, each step crashing like boulders slamming into the earth. Just before they collided, the vice president summoned a black sword. Dark ink bloomed along its blade, liquid in texture, but burning like fire. With a swift upward slash, he carved it through the air. The other student charged directly into the arcing ink trail. The vice president slipped aside, effortlessly dodging the impact. The moment the bulky student passed through the stained air, he stumbled. His thick stone armor now bore splashes of that burning black ink, as though a cauldron of it had been hurled at him. The boy lost orientation for a few seconds, stumbling in disarray. But those few seconds were more than enough. The vice president was already in motion, efficient, surgical. Even before the boy staggered, he had pivoted sharply and hurled his blade with precision toward the boy's exposed back. The sword struck home. It drove into a thin seam where the stone armor hadn't fully sealed. With a deft flick of his wrist, so sharp it could have cut silence, he twisted the blade, forcing a chunk of the armor to splinter and blast off in fragments. In the same breath, his fist crashed into the opening like a falling hammer. The dull-eyed boy reeled forward, nearly collapsing to his knees. But he stopped, frozen mid-fall like a marionette caught between strings, then jerked upright and spun, a blur of retaliation aimed to strike. But the vice president was already gone. He danced ahead of the blow, sword and footwork weaving in tandem. With a quick shift of momentum, he redirected the boy's wild strike, throwing his arm wide to break his balance. Given the weight that the boy carried, the tactic was genius. As the student faltered, the vice president swept in low, his leg slicing a brutal arc. His foot smashed into the boy's side, and stone exploded from the impact, shards flying like glass under pressure. Still, it wasn't without cost. The vice president landed hard, bracing himself, jaw clenched through the pain, but his momentum never broke. He surged upright, sword slashing upward, inking the air once more. The boy stumbled into the dark haze and crashed to the ground. Another moment of disorientation. He remained down for several long seconds, breath shallow, eyes vacant. Then, groaning, he rose again. This time, he shifted strategy. The stone armor peeled back from his body, retreating into his arms alone, condensing into massive gauntlets around his spindly forearms. He charged. Though his torso was now bare of stone, the black ink still clung to him, like a curse that refused to fade. The vice president watched in silence, still, calm. But there was a glint in his eyes, a cold, poised wickedness. A scabbard shimmered into existence in his hand as the boy leapt, aiming to bring all his might crashing down. At the last possible moment, the vice president sheathed his sword. As the blade slid into its resting place, the ink smeared across the boy's body erupted. A burst of dark smoke swallowed him whole, snuffing his momentum like a candle in a storm. Already anticipating it, the vice president darted forward, vanishing into the haze. Seconds later, both of them emerged. The boy came tumbling out, limbs flailing. He rolled all the way to the edge of the arena, where he lay still, unconscious. The vice president stepped out calmly as the smoke unraveled behind him, fading like a whisper. He didn't bask in victory. He didn't celebrate. He simply turned his head and fixed his gaze on the next opponent. His eyes, cold and calculating, promised more than just a fight. Chapter 904. Control. The vice president continued to stare with cold intensity, even as the medic team hauled his fallen opponent out of the arena. The next challenger stepped forward. A girl, tall and slender, her orange hair tied back in a taut ponytail. Pale blue eyes sat beneath her lashes, delicate and uncertain, holding surprise, fear, and hesitation like trapped birds behind glass. She ascended the stage quietly, rubbing the side of her hand and avoiding the vice president's gaze. Shay narrowed his eyes for a moment, noting the subtle twitches in her expression. His auburn hair drifted in the breeze, now growing colder as the morning air transitioned toward noon. She was still stalling, but the moment the examiner signaled the start of the match, something inside her snapped. A spear shimmered into her grip. She twirled it in one hand, the shaft a rich brown hue that gleamed faintly in the growing light. Her expression twisted, an unhinged, crooked grin creeping up her face as her once gentle eyes ignited with a manic gleam. In the blink of an eye, she became someone else entirely. That transformation unsettled Shay, though he locked away the concern. There was no time. She was already lunging at him, fast as a bolt of instinct. He drew his sword in a blur, raising it above his head just in time to meet the descending spear. Steel collided with steel, and a shockwave rippled outward in a perfect ring. His legs trembled slightly under the impact, but he shifted the blade's angle and used her momentum against her, making her falter sideways. He pressed the opening. A cascade of rapid kicks followed, sharp, fluid, relentless. His legs whipped at her like thorns on a storm-born vine, fast enough to blur. Every movement was precise, like he was striking notes on an invisible instrument. But she was no fragile opponent. She spun her weapon, stepped back, twisted away, blocked, sidestepped. Every motion tight, practiced, wild. She didn't just evade. She mirrored his rhythm. She danced with him, her spear arced to her side, carving a vicious, elegant spiral before she dashed forward, spinning the shaft above her head and lunging with accumulated force. Shay's sword flashed outward, trailing black afterimages. Steel met spear with a shriek of force. He deflected the blow with raw power, but she was already pivoting into another strike, hurling herself into the fight like a wildfire refusing to die. She wasn't just reacting. She was studying him. Every nuance of his stance, his shifts in balance, his movements. She drank it all in with uncanny clarity. Shay tightened his grip. As the vice president of the academy, and the right hand of someone like Nasira, who wore irresponsibility like a crown, Shay had always been the one to calculate, to plan, to carry the burden of consequence. And he was good at it. Not because he craved titles or admiration, but because he loved to calculate. Shay was the type to map out every strike in his mind before a single blow was exchanged. That was exactly what he'd done with his last opponent. Predict, dismantle, finish. He was ruthless, precision embodied, and the nature of his talent only deepened that edge, deceptive, crafty, tailored perfectly to his style. But most people never looked twice at him. Many assumed he was hiding behind Nasira's shadow, the quiet strategist tucked away under a louder crown. Today, the ordinary students were seeing him for what he truly was. Dangerous, lethal. And for someone like Shay, whose every win hinged on cold, clean control, having an opponent who was not only watching him just as closely, but laughing through the chaos was a devastating shift. The girl's grin widened as she began to circle him slowly, dragging her spear along the floor with a screeching sound that sent a tremor through the air. She tilted her head and lifted her chin. "Oh? Do you find yourself at a disturbing crossroads, a vice president?" Her voice slithered through the space between them, mocking, satisfied, and disturbingly pleased with what she saw. Shay frowned, a flicker of confusion passing over his face. "Do I know you?" The girl's grin widened, eyes glinting with something unhinged. Her voice came, lilting like a chime dipped in venom. "You could never. But I know your kind. Your type. Your person. Not you. Don't insult me. I could never know a cannon fodder like you." Shay's frown deepened. His eyes narrowed as he subtly tracked her movements, quietly calculating, steadily observing. She kept circling, her feet light, movements taunting. "You think you've got the world in your grasp, don't you?" Her voice slipped into something eerie, low, jagged, unsettling in its cadence. It didn't belong to her face, not at first glance. But the grin she wore, the twisted thing carved across her lips, matched it perfectly. "In that tiny, arrogant head of yours, you believe there's an answer to everything. That if you think hard enough, calculate precisely enough, you'll win." Shay studied her in silence, frown etched firmly in place. After a pause, his voice emerged, calm and even. "You speak as if you bear a grudge." She stopped. Her grin, "Oh, my rotting soul, what is it with these sprouting seedlings, thinking they matter so much? Why would I hold a grudge against a child?" Shay tilted his head slightly, something strange glinting in his gaze. "You speak as though you weren't one yourself." She sneered and waved him off, expression contorting with disgust. "Never mind, boy. You wouldn't understand. Your mind is far too small. But, for what it's worth, I don't just intend to defeat you today. I want to break you. I want to shatter your precious little mind." A silence stretched between them, taut and razor-edged. Shay said nothing. He simply watched her. For a few moments he was still as stone. Then, slowly, he raised his sword. His expression unreadable, face calm, but his thoughts a storm beneath the surface. Her grin returned wider, more grotesque than before. "Good. Good." Her pupils dilated. Her grin widened into a twisted crescent, teeth clenched in delight. "Because the only control here is the one I'm wielding." And with that, she launched forward, spear arcing, madness igniting her step. Chapter 905, Tremendous. Clang, clang, clang. Sparks scattered like fireflies on the verge of combustion as the girl lashed out from every direction, her spear snapping through the air like a whip bound to her sheer will. She fought with unchained ferocity. Every motion, every strike was untamed precision. Shay, for his part, kept pace. His sword moved like a needle threading through chaos, deflecting each punishing blow with the same calculated sharpness he was known for. But the truth lingered in the tension of each clash. Tremendous. That was the word. Every strike she launched was tremendous, overwhelming in weight, speed, and unpredictability. And he felt it. His hands ached with each deflection, the shock of her momentum digging into his bones. But pain was irrelevant. Shay's mind stayed sharp. His reflexes never betrayed him. The girl blurred in and out like a specter of madness. One moment she was driving him back with relentless aggression. The next she was behind him, her spear whipping through the air like a rope spun from storm winds. She moved with reckless precision, deliberately vanishing into distance only to reappear, thrusting her spear forward like a lightning bolt let loose. Shay's hands met her chaos with matching fury. He parried each strike, his sword arm slashing in rapid arcs. Their weapons blurred. Their hands vanished. Steel danced against steel in an almost invisible exchange, each movement a beat in an escalating symphony of violence. From the sideline, Northern watched with an icy gleam in his eyes. He didn't like how the battle was evolving. The vice president, formidable, graceful, a maestro of calculated violence, was being stretched. And it wasn't about stamina. It was intent. The girl was dragging something out of him. She fought with a deceptive rhythm, chaotic, seductive. A style that provoked reaction, demanded adaptation, and lured her opponent to meet her on her terms. It was designed to bait, to pull the best out of her enemies just to show them it wasn't enough, to force them into urgency, then break their rhythm. Northern saw the trap for what it was. It was combat theater, a psychological war, a performance meant to unseat certainty. Because in no manual of war, in no strategy scroll, was it ever written that you follow your opponent's pace and come out the victor. Not in battles like this. Not between drifters. To win, you had to impose your own rhythm, even when the world screamed otherwise. That was the essence of style, the core of a drifter's combat philosophy. Lose your rhythm and you lose your edge. Lose your edge, and the battle is already over. In that moment, Shay's movements began to falter. Inkfire splashed through the air as his blade carved black arcs, each slash vivid and precise. But it wasn't enough. She was too fast. Gone before his blade could find her. And already behind him, felt deliberate, premeditated, as if she'd read his every move, as if she expected him to use his talent ability and used it to bait him into a trap. Her hand struck like a hammer. A devastating blow slammed into his side, snapping through his ribs with a bone-crushing crack. The shock wave from the impact tore across the arena, and the very air seemed to quiver. Shay went flying. He tumbled across the arena floor, body skidding in a wild arc, until he ground to a halt, catching himself with his palms and digging in with his heels. Slowly, he pushed to his feet. His expression remained composed, cold as ever, but deep in his eyes burned an unspoken fire, just barely contained beneath that glassy surface. The girl watched him rise and let out a low, mocking chuckle. There, Vice President. There. Her tone dripped with false sympathy, twisted into cruelty. Shay still had no clue who she was or what she wanted. But her voice, her grin, her entire presence was beginning to gnaw at the edges of his control. Yet he couldn't dismiss her skill. She was good. Too good. How could someone like her exist unnoticed within the combat school? The system didn't allow hidden threats to fester quietly. Power was always spotted, documented, tracked, even outside the student council's reach. But this girl, she was an anomaly, and there was that sudden, violent shift in personality at the beginning of the battle. The more he thought about it, the more wrong everything felt. It didn't add up. This wasn't just a question of talent. In fact, he hadn't seen her use her talent. It was something else. Something twisted. Oh, you never learn, do you? Her voice slithered through the air, sending a chill down his spine. Go ahead, Vice President. Think. Let's see if you can logic your way out of this. Her grin stretched wider, lips parting in a diabolical arc. Shay's eyes narrowed. He didn't speak. He simply raised his sword, locked onto her, and then surged forward. The girl's expression twisted with glee, like her face might split from the weight of that manic smile. She waited, and when he came within reach, she struck. Her spear lashed out, smashing into his incoming strike with monstrous force. Shay staggered back, thrown off balance. She darted in and drove her fist into his gut. Before he could recover, she seized his shoulder, gripping it like iron, and slammed her forehead into his skull. His vision shuddered. The world swam, and in that heartbeat of disorientation, everything unraveled. Still gripping him, she yanked him forward and crushed her knee into his chest. A rib cracked, maybe more. She released him, let him stagger, dazed, breathless. But she wasn't finished. She was already moving. From the stands, Northern's eyes darkened. His jaw clenched at the next motion. Her spear vanished and reappeared in a blink, slicing through the air with almost disappearing speed. Then impaled Shay. Blood sprayed like a burst pipe. The force of the strike lifted his entire frame. His body arched, suspended midair. She yanked the spear free, and he crumpled. Trembling, broken, agony rippled through every muscle as his body collapsed to the ground in a lifeless heap. Chapter 906. Nasira of the Northern Continent. The entire Colosseum fell into a hushed, almost sacred silence as Shay's body crashed to the ground, blood unfurling beneath him like a crimson stain of finality. A cold dread swept through the crowd, silent but tangible, crawling under their skins like a second, colder wind. Eyes widened, mouths parted, soundless. Disbelief collided with horror, and neither blinked first. It was more prominent among the students, but even the mundane spectators, those untrained in battle, felt it. A collective shiver rippled across the audience, born not from empathy, but something far more primal. Even Northern's battles, domineering and ferocious as they were, had never unsettled the crowd like this. This was different, twisted, felt less like a duel and more like an execution. The girl, she might actually kill the vice president. Northern's expression was carved from iron, a deep scowl etched across his face. His gaze snapped toward the lone figure standing just beyond the arena's edge, grinning. Pleased. This is it? This is what he wanted. Was it about the student council president? Or was it about the dread? This oppressive emotion now suffocating the students? If it was about Shay, then maybe it ended here. But if it was about the dread itself, the show was only beginning. Northern's eyes drifted to the council president. Nasira, born of the Northern Continent, wielder of the hammer he himself had forged. Before he was curious about her upcoming battle, but now he was beginning to worry. She was strong. No doubt she'd defeat the girl. But that man, the one smiling like a puppeteer after cutting the final string, she wouldn't be able to defeat him. Not because of strength, but because he hadn't lifted a single finger. He'd been fighting through the bodies of his teammates this entire time. Possession. That was the only explanation Northern could grasp. Some facet of his talent must allow him to inhabit others, maybe even amplify them, strengthen them in ways no one saw coming. Because in a place like Mygard Academy, a student strong enough to challenge the council vice president would never be unknown. And yet, here she was, a girl who didn't look the part, didn't look like someone capable of dismantling the vice president. But when she grinned, that grin, it mirrored the dark-haired man at the edge. There was something in it, a familiarity, a shared madness, and that was all Northern needed. The conclusion became inevitable. This wasn't her battle. It was his. He had been fighting all along. As the medics carried away the vice president, Nasira was already climbing onto the arena platform. The students were seething, anger boiling over into chants and shouts that rattled the Colosseum walls. Avenge our vice president. Teach her a lesson. Show her the peak strength of Mygard Academy. And truly, by all measures, Nasira was the peak strength of Mygard Academy. If one wished to understand the Academy's upper limits, its finest edge, Then they had to look no further than her. Northern watched in silence. Curious, yes, but more than that, worried. From their brief conversation that morning, he'd sensed something different about her. A strange comfort. He hadn't met many people who knew as much about plants and trees as he did, let alone someone who could speak of them with the same reverence. If it were possible, he wanted to be her friend. To share notes, talk about roots, chlorophyll, the secret music of saplings. Learn from her. But for that to happen, she had to survive. If that man had caused all this carnage using just a puppet, there was no telling what kind of chaos he could unleash when he acted directly. His goal was clear now, to seed dread deep into every spectator's heart. Should I just hijack the fight? Northern clenched his jaw. The urge gnawed at him, but he knew better. He couldn't afford to be reckless. Everyone around him still believed that man was just another student. Jumping in would disrupt a lot of balance, and the whole event could be thrown into chaos. He could just settle all of this by defeating the guy during their duel. But more troubling was the creeping realization. The minds of those around him were being influenced. Subtly, perceptibly, en masse. Northern. He had always been unusually resistant to hexes. But even he felt the pressure. He scratched his head in frustration, fingers dragging through his hair before he dropped his hand and let out a sharp breath. Ellis noticed and spoke quietly. "You're really worried. Are you sure you don't want to talk about it?" Northern's gaze slid back to Nasira, now standing at the heart of the arena. He exhaled. "Considering this will play out in a few minutes, there's probably no point." Then, as if chasing distraction, he turned slightly toward Ellis. "But hey, how've you been? What you been up to lately?" Ellis blinked. His expression twisted like he'd bitten into something sour. He glanced around, once left, once right, then looked back at him, confused. "Isn't this literally the worst time to ask that?" He gestured toward the arena, where the next clash was moments from beginning. Northern offered a crooked, sheepish grin from the corner of his mouth. "Yeah, right." His eyes returned to the battlefield. Nasira was already unstrapping the hammer from her back, her expression unreadable, serene, detached. To most, she might have seemed distant, even distracted. But Northern followed her gaze. It lingered on the bloodstains darkening the arena floor. She moved her eyes across the battleground, calm and deliberate, lifting the hammer with a grace that betrayed its true weight. To the crowd, it looked effortless. But Northern knew better. She's strong. No doubt about that. His first successful forge had found its match, a wielder worthy of the weapon. And as the air thickened with tension, that quiet pride in him began to rise. "Oi, President. Enough look around, okay. Time to fight." The girl swirled her spear with a frightening speed and shot forward. In that moment, something jaw-breaking happened. Chapter 907. Daughter of Winterbound. As the girl grasped her spear and spun it with ferocious speed, Nasira shifted the weight of her hammer and her stance. A slow, deliberate adjustment. Her gaze rose, locking onto her opponent with a calm that bordered on contempt. Then the girl lunged. Nasira moved. Her movement was soft, almost lazy. But in the very next breath, the girl who had been charging forward was suddenly airborne. Eyes stretched wide, caught mid-run in a moment she would never complete. What the crowd saw next was only the aftermath, the echo of a blow that had already fallen. Nasira's hammer had soundlessly slammed into the girl's skull, sending her hurtling across the arena like a broken marionette. She crashed near the platform's edge, limbs folding and rolling until she slipped off the stage entirely. The council president let her hammer dip low, holding it in one hand like it weighed nothing. Her expression remained cold, detached, unbothered, as if she hadn't just delivered a death blow to a fellow student. Silence swept through the Colosseum. Among the rows of the student council seated in the right corner of the stands, several members visibly flinched. One swallowed hard. Another gripped the bench a little tighter. "Damn it, Nasira is pissed. I've never seen her that angry. I didn't even see her move until she had already stopped. I'm suddenly worried for that student," He's been doing well so far, but now? This feels like a death sentence. What do you take our student council for, you nut juice? Nasira's one of the most emotionally intelligent people I know. She wouldn't just pass aggression. Yeah. No kidding, except you also once said she never gets angry, and yet here we are. Come on, guy. How can you even say that after seeing what she just did to our vice president? No. I'm just saying. Saying what, huh? Sainji what? Haha, never mind. My bad. Down below, the medics were already in motion, running across the platform as they scrambled to attend to the fallen. The final participant from the opposing team stepped onto the stage. Black hair danced in the breeze, faintly ruffled by the gentle wind. The Daystar hung high above, brilliant, though its warmth had been strangled by the encroaching cold. Most of its heat was stolen before it ever reached the earth, lost to the frostbitten horizon. Nasira shifted the weight of her hammer again, just slightly. There was a flicker of change in her cold gaze. It was still frosted over with detachment, but now, a thin film of wariness crept beneath, a quiet vigilance. She studied the boy standing before her, measuring something more than just his stance. The lone student lingered in silence, his gaze sweeping across the Colosseum. An endless sea of spectators, row after row of students staring down at the stage. His eyes returned to Nasira. There was a downturn in his lips. Disappointment, subtle but sharp. Nasira remained unmoving, shielded behind her stillness, watching. Then the student fixed his dark eyes directly on her. "OII President, do you know the history of Milgard Academy? The truth about that despicable man called Milwa, the one you all now celebrate like he did the world some grand favor?" Nasira wasn't much for conversation. She rarely spoke, and even now words failed her. She only shrugged in reply, her face unreadable, her stare cold and unwavering. The boy's lips twitched, something sour forming beneath them. Her silence wasn't apathy to him. It was insult, disrespect. He slapped his own cheek once, hard enough to leave a mark. A strange, bitter grin cut across his face. "Oh, bless the hunter of souls. I forgot I'm supposed to be a child right now." Nasira's head tilted slightly at the phrase. Her brow furrowed for the first time. She opened her mouth to speak, but the words slipped away, unformed. For a moment, she searched her mind, tried to remember what she meant to say, but it vanished like snow in sunlight. Then the boy's voice dropped into something heavier. "But I know you. Daughter of Winterbound." Nasira's eyes widened. A different light flickered inside her. Dark, wary, ancient. "How do you know my father's true name?" Her voice came softly, barely there, like breath across glass. Not agitated, not cold, just hollow, as if she were sinking into something deeper than fear. Her father's true name wasn't sacred in the usual sense. In the North, names weren't bound by secrecy. People bore them openly if they chose. But no one here should know it. No one from the Central Plains. The legends of the northern continent had always been sealed off, kept under ice and oath. A form of preservation, not pride. Outsiders were not welcomed. Visitors were turned back or lost in the cold. For someone from the Central Plains to know the name of the king of North Row, impossible. Unless he was one of them. Nasira stared at the boy more closely now. But no, it didn't add up. Northern folk were pale, skin so light it often looked carved from snow. Their presence always carried a chill. And black hair was rarer than warmth in the northern continent. This boy had neither the pallor nor the cold. No trace of the north clung to him. So how? A crude grin split across his face as he tilted his head, a wicked white glint flaring in the depths of his dark gaze. Did I hit a nerve? Daughter of Winterbound. Every time he uttered her father's true name so casually, it stoked a heat inside her. An unfamiliar, burning weight swelling in her chest. Not rage, not yet, but something primal and sacred being scraped raw. And his grin, gods, that grin. It looked just like that of the girl she had just defeated. Twisted. like a cracked mirror smile stitched onto the wrong face. Nasira's brows folded into a scowl, her small face taut with quiet fury. In that moment, her serene beauty flared with a radiant, almost divine anger, holy and chilling, like a snowstorm touched by flame. "Who are you?" she asked, her voice low, sharp, but his grin only stretched wider, eyes glimmering with madness. He drawled, voice taunting and theatrical. "Why, lady? Did I finally pique your interest?" He lifted one hand like a conductor ready to unleash a symphony of chaos. "Oh, spare me the talk, daughter of Winterbound. Swing your hammer." With a snap of his fingers, reality behind him cracked. Several stars of black light bloomed into existence, hovering in the air. Each one coalesced with a low, ominous hum, forming sleek, jagged black blades that spun around him in orbit, ringing with a hollow clangor that echoed like the tolling of distant war bells. Chapter 908. Hammer of Judgment. The swords shot forward, blurring with ferocious black speed, twisting and twirling through the air like a storm of fangs. Nasira surged ahead with a soundless step, twirling her hammer into motion. Each clash between hammer and blade detonated with thunderous force, sending tremors crackling through the arena. She moved like a drifting leaf, an image that defied the brutal weight of the weapon she wielded. Sometimes, she held the hammer with one hand, swinging it in fluid arcs. Other times, she hurled it overhead with both arms, crashing down upon the swords. Yet no blade shattered. Instead, each one stiffened on impact, vibrating in the air with a hollow, haunting ring. There was no room for breath. Another set of black swords surged forward, even faster than before. An unrelenting storm. Nasira flowed too, elegant, springing, untouchable. Often, spectators lost sight of her entirely, glimpsing only the violent recoil of the black swords to track where she had struck. She crushed another wave of blades from the flank. Her hammer belched with a crackling roar, a godly sound, and from the strike, chains of lightning burst forth. Spirals of electricity leapt into the air, linking to nearby swords, causing them to stiffen and vibrate violently in their orbit. But Nasira was already gone again. She hurled her hammer behind her, shooting forward like a silent tempest, if such a thing could exist. She closed the distance between herself and the strange student. Yet he was no idle spectator. With a sweep of his arms, like a maestro conjuring madness, the black swords responded, swooping back toward her with lethal precision, aiming for her exposed back. Nasira twisted sharply, pivoting in midair. In a single fluid motion, she slammed her hammer into one sword, shattering its momentum. As she landed, she rolled into another motion, swinging to crush the next incoming blade. She was airborne again, flipping through the sky with an unnatural grace. And as she fell, she struck the ground with a devastating hammer blow that should have torn her limbs apart. Instead, a massive shockwave rippled out. The black swords froze in place, hanging stagnant in the air like marionettes with severed strings. In that moment, Nasira lowered her hammer, letting it touch the ground for the first time since the battle began. Her eyes closed gently. A faint blue light spiraled around the weapon, encasing it like mist drawn to flame. The glow extended from the hammer's surface, linking to her hands where they rested upon the shaft. Then came the runes, no, not runes, patterns of glyphs, ancient and flowing. They ignited along the hammer's length, from the worn shaft to the broad hammerhead, pulsing with hidden power. In the crowd, Northern held his breath. He didn't remember giving that hammer such a trait. But the answer presented itself. "You have discovered talent. Relic-born, SS. You do not have a slot to copy this talent." Northern scowled. "Damn it. I can't wait for these 3 months to fly by." His focus snapped back to the stage. The glowing glyphs spread upward, wrapping around Nasira's forearms, forming warlike tattoos that pulsed with subtle energy. She adjusted her grip on the sledgehammer, dragging it across the ground to her other side. The motion realigned her stance, optimized now to channel the hammer's momentum, to control the battlefield through weight and rhythm. The air around her changed, subtly crackling with something unseen. Yet the faint hiss of burning energy whispered through the silence, like static clinging to the air. Across from her, the strange student narrowed his eyes and lifted a hand to his face. Instantly, the floating light of black swords responded. They converged, merging into each other, growing darker, longer, denser. Shadows thickened as the blades fused into one enormous weapon, and it loomed above the council president like a reaper's verdict. Nasira didn't flinch. Her face remained blank, carved from calm. Her glowing blue eyes were distant, cold and ethereal. The massive sword hovered, suspended like judgment in the sky. The Colosseum fell still. Even the wind held its breath. Then came the eruption. The colossal black sword surged skyward, a streak of black lightning twisting around it like a helix of wrath. And Nasira moved. She blurred forward with a force that defied description, chasing the wind itself. The great sword, now arcing down, plummeted with unspeakable speed, like a pillar of darkness sent to smite the unworthy. Ironic, the hammer was in the hands of judgment. Yet in the moment before impact, Nasira vanished. When she reappeared, she was already behind him. Her hammer screamed through the air, carving a vicious arc toward his skull. The student's eyes widened, twisting into a mask of dark disgust. At the last heartbeat, he ducked, and the hammer wheezed past his hair, missing him by the breadth of a whisper. But there was no pause. In retaliation, a cluster of black spears materialized in the air and lunged at Nasira from all sides. She moved the hammer like it weighed nothing, like it was a sword in the hands of a duelist. Each swing deflected a spear with blinding precision. Sparks burst with every impact, echoes ringing like divine percussion. The student used the chaos to flee, but Nasira was already moving again, her figure a streak of force racing across the field. High above, the massive black sword, which had halted mid-strike when she vanished, now flared back to life. With a blinding flash, it tore through the air, surging forward once more. This time, aiming to intercept her path directly. Her gaze narrowed, tight with resolve, unwavering. As she sprinted forward, charging straight toward the colossal sword now barreling toward her in a horizontal blur of blackened light. Her arms sparked, electricity coursing through her veins like storm-touched rivers. The hammer crackled in her grip. The glyphs etched along it surged brighter, alive with pulsing energy, like veins feeding an ancient force. Then, in the instant before impact, Nasira shifted. A subtle sidestep, precise, calculated. She opened a path for the massive sword to slice past her harmlessly. But that path didn't remain empty for a millisecond. From behind her came the real strike. The glowing hammer, hurled with perfect timing, met the obsidian blade head-on. The collision was cataclysmic. A blinding burst of light exploded between them. The air screamed. Electricity rippled out in jagged waves, surging through the black sword like a wildfire of pure voltage. The obsidian blade shuddered, its form distorting, writhing against the hammer's power. Caught in the clash of divine steel and condensed shadow, electromagnetic force rippled across the arena, vibrating through the ground. Dust spiraled. Spectators shielded their faces. In that instant, it felt as if the world itself had flinched. Chapter 909, Dawn of Black Swords. White veins of light surged across the blade like strands of rabid madness. As it reached the tip, the light pulsed with blinding intensity, and with a resounding, tremendous impact, the sword exploded, shattering into fragments of vanishing light. The man stood frozen, his eyes wide for several heartbeats. Then, slowly, his lips curled into a smile. Oh, my lightless soul, you really are strong. Indeed, the people of the northern continent are closer to the peak of civilization that was once lost. Nasira wasn't sure what he was saying and why he was smiling, but something about that grin gnawed at her. Bitter, mocking, unwarranted, crawled beneath her skin. She wanted nothing more than to wipe it off his rotten face with the flat of her hammer. The burning in her chest responded to that desire. It grew intensely. Her breath quickened, rising with her temper. Northern, meanwhile, seated high among the spectators, was speechless. His eyes remained wide, terribly wide, still arrested by the sheer, terrifying force Nasira had just displayed. How is she that strong? With an SS-class talent. He couldn't understand it. Nasira was living proof that talent class wasn't everything. Not nearly as much as people made it out to be. To him, the constant glorification of talent class was a farce, a tool used by the privileged to inflate their sense of worth. A propaganda weapon. Talent class was just a seed, a glimpse of possibility, not a finished product. The true hierarchy? Soul rank. Of course, among students it wasn't so simple. Their world hadn't yet opened wide. They were still shackled by class, not soul. Most would only begin evolving their soul rank after graduation, when they faced real rifts and battles that forced growth. He folded his arms and leaned back, eyes narrowing with renewed interest as he watched her. I'd love to fight her one day. See just how physically strong she is to be able to wield that hammer like it's nothing. There was something almost reverent in his stare, a quiet admiration reserved for only the fiercest fighters. Northern was not one to be easily impressed. But Nasira, she'd just shaken the cage of his expectations. Ellis sneakily observed the look in Northern's eyes, then shifted his gaze to the arena, curious to see what, or rather, who, his friend's eyes were fixed on. Then he looked back at him. Northern's gaze darkened in an instant. What? Ellis only grinned, tilting his head like a cat who had just caught something squirming. Oh? You're growing, aren't you? Northern frowned, the confusion plain across his face. What is that supposed to mean? Ellis reached out and gave his shoulder a pat. Don't worry, my friend. We've got a lot to catch up on. Northern muttered, leaning back again. Wipe that nasty expression off your face. Both of them turned their attention toward the battle, their previous exchange fading into silence. Down in the arena, the black-haired student stood motionless, smiling. Oh, since you're so amazing yourself, that means I should raise the standards for you, right? Nasira didn't understand what he meant, didn't care either. She wasn't one for riddles or games. Nasira was a one-dimensional person, through and through. It wasn't a flaw, not to her. It was just her way. If she wanted to kill someone, she simply would. Not out of pride. Not because she was a princess, but because that's who she was, unmoved by social noise, detached from status, from consequence, from the swirl of people that tried too hard to mean something. She saw things for what they were, or more accurately, for what she decided they were. Flat, simple, uncomplicated. Of course, there were exceptions. A flicker of a recent exception fluttered into her mind, uninvited. Her thoughts teetered for a moment. She was tempted to look away, but she didn't. She couldn't. Looking away now would mean giving this strange student an opening. Worse, she didn't want him seeing it. Didn't want him commenting about that particular person. Her new friend. Suddenly, something clicked. Her eyes widened briefly, then dimmed, quiet and cold. She whispered, mostly to herself. That's right. If she didn't defeat this strange, theatrical bastard now, then he'd be facing Northern. Or, as her one-dimensional mind had decided to name him the first time she noticed him, ABS. Her gaze thickened with unshakable resolve. The aura around her brightened, as if feeding off that clarity. Above, the student extended his hand. His smile twisted. His pupils narrowed into wicked slits. The sky quivered. Then, like a god sketching swords into the canvas of the stars, luminous blades began to carve their form across the heavens. Dozens, hundreds, each one sculpted from the light of the night, paradoxical and pure, yet reeking of violence. They filled the sky, swallowing it, smothering radiance in pale, soulless shadow. The cold air wafted through the Colosseum in a dreadful hush. What had been a bright, buzzing day dimmed abruptly, like the heavens had swallowed their own sun and the clouds now loomed, bloated with rain. A hush spread. Then murmurs. Uneasy, widespread. Heads turned upward. The sky, once endless and blue, was now host to a swarm of black swords. Not dozens, not hundreds, an endless congregation, suspended midair like a graveyard frozen in time. People muttered beneath their breath. Questions crawled up their throats. Was this really necessary? Could anyone, even the president of the student council, endure this many blades? Wouldn't she break? Would she collapse under the pressure of defending against such a cataclysm? Even Northern, seated among the higher rows, shared the unease sweeping through the crowd. And he was not the type to be easily shaken. The sheer number was staggering, towering, absurd. Nasira might make that massive hammer look light, like it was a simple sword tossed with grace, but he, more than anyone, knew how much force it took to wield something like that. He'd felt the strain of battle, the scream of ligaments, the quiet agony of bone pushed too far. There was no way her arms weren't screaming beneath that composed face. And for the first time since the duel started, Northern felt pity. I hope she can actually win this. He couldn't remember the last time he'd watched a match with such sincerity. Sitting back, jaw tight, hoping his choice of victor would actually pull through. And it wasn't just him. The entire Colosseum had fallen into a trance of shared tension, everyone collectively holding their breath. The crowd was heavy with anticipation, rooting not with shouts, but with silence. Hope twisted through them like a quiet prayer. They wanted her to win. Even though her situation looked hopeless, comically so, they still clung to a miracle or, at the very least, brute defiance. The president of the student council had to prevail. The peak of Milgard Academy could not fall. Not in front of everyone. Even the instructors, stoic and seasoned, stood tensely at the edges, their gazes sharp, their throats locked. The rising storm before them was beginning to swallow the very laws of decorum. And yet, Nasira, there she stood. In the eye of this monstrous swarm of swords, hundreds of thousands, maybe even millions, without a flicker of fear on her face. Detached, oblivious, too one-dimensional, perhaps, to notice that the entire Colosseum had turned into her cheering court. Too uninterested in public sentiment to care. She shifted her hammer slightly, and the light in her eyes gleamed, cold and unfazed. Lightning crackled. It danced from the glowing glyphs along her sledgehammer, slithering like falling chains and hissing as it sparked. The weapon pulsed. Alive. Ready. Across from her, the black-haired student grinned. It was a wicked expression, lips parted with theatrical glee. A sword manifested beneath his feet, and then lifted him. He rose into the sky like a devil-winged seraph, carried by his arsenal. The lightless swords answered him, shifting subtly in formation, as if welcoming their master among their ranks. And still the sky darkened, and still Nasira didn't flinch. His grin stretched impossibly wide as he covered a half of his face with one hand and raised the other. His eerie, pleasured voice crept out. Now, let the carnage begin. He dropped his hand. Chapter 910. Definition of tenacity. Nasira stirred, just slightly. The chains of lightning clanging around her gave a hollow metallic echo, the crackle of electromagnetic force whispering in the charged air. Then, like a rain of weapons, the uncountable black blades descended. Each moved with a will of its own, yet flowed together in a vicious, perfect tandem, like a tide of death. Nasira was already moving, already flowing. Her sledgehammer swept behind her as she whooshed forward, the ground beneath her feet cracking slightly from the force. The first wave of swords struck. A violent hurricane erupted at the center of the arena, an explosion of rippling force, as Nasira blasted forward with her hammer gripped in both hands. She moved at a speed that shattered all expectations, faster than anything she had displayed before. Her body blurred across the battered stage, weaving through the deluge of blades, her hammer whirling at a terrifying, relentless pace. Each motion seemed almost effortless, and yet each strike matched the speed of the flying swords, swords that were moving faster than arrows loosed from a warbow. It should have been impossible. Her weapon, the hammer, was massive. Far too massive. The very weight that gave it devastating power should have dragged her down, slowed her, made her a sitting target beneath the endless storm. It should have been her undoing. But Nasira's strength, her raw, unrelenting strength, turned it into her greatest advantage. She wove the hammer in a deadly dance, shifting her stance with precise, brutal instinct, using the momentum and centrifugal force to swing where her blows could inflict the most catastrophic damage. And with every swing, the black blades shattered. Fragments of vanished light sprayed in every direction, littering the air like the afterimage of broken stars. Her hammer, empowered by the electric chains that licked and curled along its frame, crackled violently with every impact. The chains were not mere decoration. They were born from her talent, an extension she had discovered by chance, when her lightning abilities found resonance with the weapon. She didn't know who forged it, but she owed Elina for it. Originally, she had petitioned for a great sword, a simple, familiar weapon she had trained with for years. She was prepared for it. When Elina handed her the sledgehammer instead, she had almost objected. Almost. But then curiosity had overtaken her stubbornness. She had trained. Relentlessly. She had adapted. Yet it was never enough. Not truly. She couldn't replicate the seamless, instinctive mastery she had once held with a great sword. The hammer was heavier, crueler. It demanded a different rhythm, a different strength. And no matter how much she trained, to her, she was always too slow. At least, compared to how she remembered herself. But this slow version of her, this version she deemed sluggish, was viciously blurring through the air. She wove between the swords like a destructive specter, deflecting and shattering every single one of them. Sometimes the lightning chains wrapped around her hammer would ripple outward, almost sentient, elongating and lashing across wide swaths of descending blades. The moment they touched, a tremendous, thunderous detonation erupted, causing the very air to vibrate. The impact of those explosions stiffened nearby swords mid-flight, disrupting their precision, buying Nasira precious, brutal seconds. And through it all, she continued weaving herself forward. A storm in human form, inevitable and devastating. Her movement was a contradiction in itself. Paradox, a massive hammer, meant for slow, deliberate carnage, whirling with frightening, unnatural speed in the hands of a seemingly ordinary girl. It was an irony sharpened into deadly poetry. The speed of her hand movements defied logic. It defied even her own limitations. Clang, clang, clang. The sound of impact roared out without pause, the rhythm a mad symphony. A barrage of metallic shrieks and explosive bursts filled the Colosseum, the tempo ceaseless. It became a kind of art, a violent ballet. At the center of the arena, the storm raged. A hurricane of black swords carved from the midnight sky, falling, flying, bombarding the lone creature on the ground. But down there, in that chaos, stood a star. A savage, unyielding star. Nasira blazed in the heart of the darkness, a solitary inferno scorching every midnight blade that dared to reach her. Sparks of white-hot light sprayed around her like a halo of wild stars, thrashing violently in every direction. Shockwaves ripped through the ground with every clash, cracks webbing outward in jagged scars. The center of the Colosseum had become a black whirlpool of destruction. So thick, so ferocious, that most of the spectators couldn't even see what was happening inside. Only a few, certain instructors, and of course Northern, had eyes sharp enough to pierce through the swirling chaos. And the longer the blizzard raged, the more anxious the crowd became. Visibility inside was gone. Doubt grew like a sickness in their hearts. Hope and fear twined into a single breathless silence. Of course, not everyone was rooting for Nasira. The non-combative students, the ones who saw no value in strength, weren't particularly concerned whether she fell. In fact, a small group of them, huddled together on one side of the Colosseum, had begun booing, their voices sharp and bitter against the undercurrent of tension. But they were few. The combative students vastly outnumbered them, 2 to 1 at least, and their collective will drown the jeering like a tide crushing a handful of stones. To make it worse for the non-combative group, Half of their ranks weren't even present today. Still, the ones that remained had found a voice lately. A voice encouraged by a certain person. Speaking of that person, he was seated among the crowd, leaned forward, elbows resting on his knees, his gaze locked into the storm of black swords. Inside the storm of swords, Nasira was still moving, still deflecting, still breaking apart every blade with the crushing might of her hammer. Each sword that struck her was met with brutal force, bursting into shards of fading light the moment her hammer touched them. The lightning chains coiled around her weapon crackled and soared wildly, lashing through the storm like frenzied serpents, detonating clusters of blades in sweeping arcs. And yet her speed did not dim. That was, perhaps, the most astonishing thing about her. She had a tenacious spirit, unyielding, relentless, almost inhuman. Northern watched from above, and for a brief, rare moment, he found himself wordless. He couldn't begin to imagine the pain she must be enduring. How her muscles, her arms, her shoulders, her hands, must be screaming. How each swing must send tremors of agony rattling up her bones. He couldn't imagine it, and yet she fought on. The rain of swords did not relent. If anything, it grew worse. As if some cruel mind had decided it wasn't enough, certain swords began to merge midair, forming larger, more devastating monstrosities. They plunged downward, hurtling towards Nasira at speeds so vicious the very air split apart in their wake. She glanced up. A flicker of calculation crossed her otherwise detached face. Then she moved, swift, precise. She shifted her footing, tracing a quick step back, her hammer swung behind her. And as the monstrous sword came screaming down from the sky, she unleashed a brutal, sweeping arc with the hammer. The moment of impact was surreal. Time seemed to stutter. The edge of her hammer met the sword, and for a fraction of a heartbeat the world paused. The hammer absorbed the kinetic force, drank it inward, then crackled, swelling with lightning so intense it turned white. And then, all at once, the energy was released. A blinding explosion of force erupted outward. The colossal sword shattered into fragments before it even had a chance to resist. But it didn't end there. The unleashed lightning didn't simply vanish. It lashed outward in savage whips, snapping through the storm like a broken power plant tearing itself apart. The shockwave barreled through the black swords surrounding her. Chain detonations followed, one after another, a roaring chorus of destruction. The Colosseum was drowned in noise, a ferocious, deafening sound. It was like a mighty rushing wind. No, not one, but hundreds of them. All screaming, all converging violently toward the center of the arena. Chapter 9:11. The Savior, Part 1. A storm of explosions bellowed at the center of the arena, rising with flashes of lightning and fire that soared into the sky, carving through the clouds as if aiming for the heavens, or so it seemed. The entire place became wrapped in a thick cloud of debris, so dense that nothing could be seen. The aftermath left a deep, vibrating hum, as though the very thunder itself was belching from the earth. The wind turned violent, blowing fiercely against the spectators, almost threatening to throw them off their seats. Many struggled to hold on. Several staggered away, tumbled down, but it was considered a light matter. The Colosseum, after the horrid gusts, fell into a heavy silence for a moment. Then a moment became two. Then three. The dust slowly flowed at the center, while everyone sat frozen in eerie silence, watching tensely. The fact that they could not see through the dust cloud only made the tension harder to bear. Slowly, agonizingly, the dust began to dissipate. A silhouette became faintly visible, and as seconds crawled by, the visual within the settling dust grew clearer. People leaned forward anxiously, almost falling from their seats in their desperation to see who or what had survived. Northern grimaced from his seat. He clenched his fists tightly. Nasira was standing barely. The head of her hammer rested heavily on the ground. Her hands slumped over it, supporting the entirety of her body as she heaved for breath. Drop, drop. She stared downward with a blank gaze, watching as small drops of red stained the floor beneath her. Slowly, She peeled her trembling hands from the shaft of her hammer. Blisters had formed, burst, formed again, and burst once more, until blood-filled blisters, too, had ruptured. Her pale palms were smeared with dried crimson and fresh, oozing wounds, and her hands wouldn't stop shaking. Blood, too, was trickling from her nose. Above her, someone was descending slowly atop a massive dark blade. He stared down at her, a cold, condescending glare etched deep into his face. His voice boomed like the settling of destruction as he lowered to the ground. "I must say, I am quite surprised." His voice trailed off as he finally reached the ground, stepping down from the hovering blade. With a casual flick of his hand, the dark greatsword floated neatly into his grip. "To think a little child could deflect thousands of my swords. Well, I suppose I should have expected as much. You are the daughter of Winterbound after all." A small, delighted smile crept across his lips. "Among the ranks of you pampered children, there are a few who can be considered special." He waved dismissively barely a second later, as if disgusted by the very thought. "Although," he added with a faint sneer, "I dislike using that word." He paused, shrugged lightly, then relented, almost mocking in tone. All right, you deserve it, so I'll make an exception. Just this once." He swung the greatsword lazily, lifting and dropping it with a nonchalant flick, as if the colossal weapon weighed no more than a feather. Then he extended it downward, the tip of the black blade almost kissing the ground. "Any last words, President?" Nasira's eyes had dimmed, her breaths heavy and ragged, her chest rising and falling like a battered mountain barely holding its shape. Her face, paler than it had been that morning, was a mess. Short white hair tangled and matted with blood. Strands clung stubbornly to her bruised skin, remnants of the few swords or shattered shards of light that had slipped through her defense. For a moment, it seemed as though the light within her, the very glint of her soul, might finally flicker out. But then, even through that dim haze clouding her gaze, she shifted. Cold, detached. Her expression did not change, not even beneath the agony etched across her battered body, not even beneath the certainty of impending defeat. She remained cold and detached, exactly as she had been since the beginning of the match. Too one-dimensional to notice, too indifferent to care. She shifted slightly, tilting the shaft of her hammer as she tried to pick it up. There was a change to her movements now, slower, heavier, her fatigue bleeding through every motion. As she lifted the hammer, a soft groan escaped her lips, though her expression remained unchanged. Gripping it with both hands, she positioned the hammer behind her, bracing her stance to support her battered body and carry the weapon's overwhelming weight. The strange student watched her, standing silently with his sword in hand. His brows furrowed darkly. "You must still be deluding yourself to think you can win this, even in your state." He breathed heavily, trying and failing to rein in the insurmountable anger burning inside him. His face twisted, contorting into a grimace. He roared, "Look at you, President. Look at you. Broken, wrecked, hopeless. You are merely a child. Why act like you are more? If you're just a damn child, then act like one. For Cryo's sake." He covered his face with one hand, dragging it down slowly. As his hand fell away, the lines of anger slowly vanished, leaving behind only a cold certainty. "All right, no problem. This will just further shatter the reckless hope you all cling to. This will pronounce the fall of the Academy and usher in a new era." He slid one foot back, falling into stance. "Die Präsident." He flashed forward, a trail of obsidian light streaming behind him. Nasira tried to raise her hammer and dash forward, but her eyes widened, trembling, as her body refused to move. Her legs buckled. The last of her strength drained away, and she collapsed to her knees. The student's eyes gleamed with manic joy. His grin stretched wide as he neared her, his sword flashing behind him, about to carve a deadly arc through the air. The Colosseum was frozen in silence. Was no one going to stop him? The council president, helpless on her knees. The battle should have been over. But wasn't this going too far? His sword swung forward brutally, thick with killing intent. At that instant, a voracious ring split through the air, a sound that shook the silence apart. For a moment, no one knew where it had come from. Had he already struck her down? Or had she managed to block it again? A beat later, gasps erupted through the Colosseum. The student's body was hurled backward, rolling violently across the air. A second later, something flew upward, his hand, severed cleanly, spinning into the sky. Eyes widened, colors drained from faces. Some covered their mouths in shock, frozen, unable to believe what they had just seen. As the lingering dust of the clash settled, a figure stood before the kneeling Nasira, a figure that made hearts pound wildly with overwhelming exhilaration. He stood tall, the council president's hammer perched casually over his shoulder, a dark and furious glint burning in his blue eyes. The entire Colosseum erupted into a deafening roar. Chapter 9:12, The Fake Student. Northern stood before Nasira, the hammer slung lazily over his shoulders. The council president knelt before him, weakened and on the verge of collapse. She opened her roughened, dimming eyes, barely able to lift her gaze to the figure standing in front of her. Her vision was blurry, but not so much that she couldn't discern who it was. Her lips moved. She seemed to mutter something, but before Northern could catch her words, she collapsed. The medics, already rushing into the arena as the dust settled, quickly reached her side. They lifted her body gently onto a stretcher and hurried away. At the far edge of the arena, the opposing student stood watching Northern. His gaze was dark and stern, a sharp light simmering in his eyes. One of his hands was missing. A heavy silence stretched between them. Then, two figures dropped into the arena, one landing before Northern, the other before the student. The man who appeared before Northern was tall and gaunt, clad in a neat gray ensemble that resembled a tuxedo, but upon closer look, it was more like a tailored armor. Scars laced his face, deep and jagged, and his heavy-lidded gaze carried a fearsome weight. None of it fazed Northern. He stared at the man impassively, fully aware that this was the same individual Professor Heimberger had tasked to monitor him. And indeed, the man had been doing a handsome job of it, though Northern suspected Heimberger wasn't the only one he reported to. Northern didn't like him. The man reeked of disloyalty, a dog who could turn and bite its master at any moment. Still, none of that showed on Northern's face. These were merely his own judgments, after all. He could be wrong, but deep down, Northern doubted it. "Step back, student." The instructor's voice was cold and hard, like stone. Northern remained silent for a few beats. Then he exhaled slowly, lifting his eyes to meet the man's face. "Why should I?" Northern's voice was calm but carried an edge. "It only makes sense that we end the battle here, doesn't it? He's down 2 team members. It's just me. If he beats me, he wins. If I beat him, I win." The instructor's tone sharpened, hard and rigid beneath the surface. "It doesn't work like that, student. After a match, each participant must be granted a grace period of 30 minutes to rest, whether they fought or not. Not to mention, you standing here right now is a foul that might cost you your precious win." Northern raised a brow. A scoff escaped him a second later. "Precious win." He let out a low, mocking chuckle. "I had my victory secured the moment the match began. Everything else since then has been child's play, until this guy showed up." He paused, his glare cutting toward the opposing student, then snapped back toward the instructor, eyes burning. Northern continued, his voice tightening with irritation. "And you know, I'm rather disappointed that even instructors can't see it." His frown deepened, the words scraping from him like blades. "Look at him, for the stars' sake. That guy isn't even a student of our school." His shout soared across the arena, the echoes whipping through the Colosseum like a gust of wind. For the first time, true attention fell on the strange student. Students began muttering among themselves, their confusion spreading like a ripple, growing louder and louder until a restless murmur filled the air. Even the instructors, seated high above, leaned forward, eyes narrowing at the boy below. It was as if a heavy veil had been lifted from their faces, exposing the strangeness they had so easily overlooked. Still, it wasn't as if they could immediately tell he wasn't a student of Milgard, but the doubt had been planted, and it was growing fast. Even the instructor addressing the student seemed to pause for a moment, hesitation creeping into his demeanor. In that brief instant, a black sword suddenly pierced through the instructor's body. Northern and his instructor both widened their eyes, and in the next breath they shot forward. Northern blasted past the scarred-faced instructor before he could even react. Yet before Northern could reach the strange student, a sword lifted the boy into the air, carrying him above Northern's head, where he hovered like a blackened star against the dimming sky. Northern frowned slightly as he looked up. He wasn't picking himself up into the air as many might have expected. Not this time, and he knew why. The durability of this clone was worn thin. If he forced it into flight, it would crumble even faster. Creating a new clone wasn't an option either, not now. He would simply be cloning the current weakened clone, which was a pointless effort. His real body, after all, was resting in the limitless void. Of course, there were ways to fix this. He always kept 3 clones stationed within the limitless void, serving as conduits, perpetual pipelines, linking him to the endless reservoir of void essence. He could pull one of them here, but it would require... Thud! His thoughts scattered as a suffocating weight pressed down from above. The atmosphere thickened, so much so that Northern instinctively snapped his focus back to the battlefield. The sky was darkening, the clouds turning pitch black. The strange student stood proudly atop the flying sword, a vile grin stretching across his face, his eyes gleaming with malice. A violent gale ripped through the arena, the winds screaming as they whipped against anything that dared remain standing. Chaos broke out instantly. Students scrambled to hold their ground, clutching onto each other to avoid being flung away by the roaring winds. And amid the storm, a blinding bolt of lightning descended from the churning black clouds. It didn't simply fall. It tore through the fabric of space itself. Reality split apart at the impact site, and from the newly rent rift, an ominous blue shimmer bled into the world. Northern's expression darkened. So did the faces of several instructors. The students, though visibly disturbed, wore paled expressions of confusion and fear. Yet their horror couldn't compare to those who understood the true weight of what was happening. A high-tier rift was emerging. Right here, right now. Northern stood rooted, staring up in grim shock, when the man's laughter boomed from above. It echoed across the shattered sky. My friend, the main character himself. This is my opening gift to you. Chapter 913, The 5 Citadels. Northern grimaced as he watched the strange guy floating above. A gift? To me? I don't even know your crappy ass. Regardless, he had to act. Something had to be done about the rift, about that guy, about the lives of the students that were now hanging by a thread. Just as he made to move, figures blurred past him, landing at scattered points across the arena. Each stood still, eyes locked on the rift with a cold, unwavering focus. Northern's gaze swept the Colosseum. Aside from the Academy instructors, easily identified by the black shoulder capes adorned with the Academy's sigil, there were 4 others. Well, technically 3. One he recognized. The first was a man who radiated danger without needing to raise his voice or unsheath a blade. His robe, half draped over a lean, scar-marked torso, hinted at old traditions, but the look in his eyes made it clear he no longer lived by them. Messy black hair fell across his face, accentuating a sly, mocking smirk that never quite reached his gaze. And those eyes, sharp, surgical, they didn't just watch. They studied. Always reading, always calculating. Standing next to him was a woman who didn't just command presence. She claimed the air itself. Not just the space around her, but the entire Colosseum seemed to bow, ever so slightly, in her direction. Her hair was cropped like a statement, platinum and wild, exposing the razor-sharp lines of her bone structure and the defiant cut of her gaze. Pale, icy irises sliced through both light and shadow, locked in an unwavering stare that dared anyone to look away first. Freckles dusted her cheeks like sparks on tempered steel, fierce, untamed, and unapologetically hers. But what truly marked her was the ink blooming across her collarbones and throat. A tapestry of florals, not delicate but predatory, blooming in the shape of war. Then came the one who stood like he was used to attention, but tired of it. His slouch was intentional, bored, almost regal in its indifference. Tousled golden hair jutted in reckless spikes, and absurdly, perched atop his head, was a round, yellow creature with long bunny ears and innocent, blinking eyes. The contrast was disorienting. He looked like a man forged in chaos, yet crowned with the emblem of peace. And finally, Northern's gaze found the one person he recognized. A girl, slight in stature, with a lean, muscled frame and the lines of a huntress drawn across her face. Her eyes still held that signature defiance, the kind Northern had never liked. And after 3 months it hadn't faded, it had only grown stronger. Yet something beneath it flickered, a suppression, a strain behind the fire. "Student, step back. Okay? Representatives of the 5 citadels will take it from here." Northern frowned, until a cold hand touched his shoulder, and a voice, soft as breath, fluttered into his ear. He hadn't even realized there was a 5th one. She stood like silence distilled into form. Every breath she took, every blink, felt deliberate. Her all-black attire clung to her like a second skin, stitched not for seduction, but for speed and precision. A belt of layered sashes cinched her waist, a statement of discipline as much as lethality. Her arms were wrapped in reinforced cloth, like a fighter who struck with accuracy, not force. Her jet-black hair was parted cleanly and swept behind her ears, framing a face not sculpted for beauty, but for intent. Sharp jawline, storm-gray eyes, brows that refused to lift unless something genuinely mattered. She wasn't the kind to waste emotion. Every inch of her was composed, controlled. She looked like someone who'd vanish the instant he blinked, and leave him doubting whether she'd been real to begin with. With a cracking voice and wide, uncertain eyes, Northern spoke or tried to. "Who? I am Celis Vorn," she interrupted, calm and precise. "You may also refer to me as Silent Tenebris." Her gaze didn't soften. It was surgical, indifferent, controlled. "I'm from the Kael'van Citadel, unarguably the strongest in the Central Plains," she continued, then added without a shift in tone. "And I'd like you sometime." "Hey, you sly witch," the platinum-haired woman shouted from her perch. "Don't you dare go poaching him when we should be focused on the rift here." Celis didn't respond with words, only a subtle smirk, as though she'd already won something no one else had noticed. With a movement so clean it was nearly imperceptible, she slipped something into Northern's pocket. Had he not been this close, he wouldn't have caught it. He was sure no one else did. Then, without pause, she walked away. Her rear moved with a calm, splendid rhythm, neither exaggerated nor restrained. Just enough to stir something unpresentable in Northern, something he hadn't felt since arriving in Trael. He quickly shook his head. Focus. Eyes forward. Rift first. Still, was it really okay to step back and let them handle this? Would they even be able to? A Tier 7 rift wasn't so difficult, even though it was devastation waiting to blossom. But only Northern and a rare few could say that with certainty. He narrowed his gaze and looked deeper, past their faces, past the theatrics. Northern looked into the soul of each one of them. Profile. Name. Vector Irevn. True name. Duality. Attributes. Unpredictability. Soul rank. Maverick. Soul core saturation. Mid. Talent. Crown of Paradox. Talent class. S. Talent abilities. Split sigil. Laughing crown. Schism pulse. Contradiction drive. Profile. Name. Avara Soline. True name. The blossom that drinks from ashes. Attributes. Dead flower. Soul rank. Transient. Soul core saturation. Mid. Talent. Blood Bloom. Talent Class. SS. Talent Abilities. Petal Brand. Thorn Kiss. Ashen Bloom. Blossom Pact. Lily of Morning. Profile. Name. Kite Caven. True name. Writing Blade. Attributes. Black ink. Red ink. Soul rank. Transient. Soul core saturation. Low. Talent. Inkstone. Talent Class. S. Talent Abilities. Scripted Draw. Red Ink Reversal. Truth Split. Erasure Split. Silent Requital. Profile. Name. Celis Vorn. True name. Silent Tenebrous. Attributes. Shadows. Soul rank. Transient. Soul core saturation. High. Talent. Umbercell. Talent Class. SS. Talent Abilities. Muffled Step. Shadow Bind. Ink Veil. Memory Eclipse. Tenebral Marionette. Profile. Name. Helena Tharvine. True name. Spirit of the Wild. Attributes. The Despondent Huntress. Soul rank. Ephemeral. Soul core saturation. Low. Talent. Wildheart. Talent Class. S. Talent Abilities. Primeval Senses. Predator's Wake. Elemental Pulse. Wild Form Awakening. Runes of the Untamed. Ancestral Howl. Northern frowned slightly. He hadn't given her much credit before. Too distracted by her defiance, by her loud presence. But Helena was strong. Stronger than he remembered. And now an ascendant. Though he doubted she achieved that in the Dark Continent. Perhaps she had help from Thaylen Citadel. That would explain why she accepted their proposal, despite being a fangirl of Raven. Still, that aside, every single person the Citadels had sent was formidable. Not just competent, they were sages. All but one. And even that one, he felt like the kind of anomaly that warped the battlefield just by existing. The 5 Citadels, they really are monsters, Northern thought, eyeing them all. If these were just the ones they were willing to send for recruitment, he could only imagine the caliber of power they kept hidden. And it made sense, they were no longer scouting just anyone. He had shifted their priorities. They were here. For him. These are no slouches. These are their best. And for the first time in a long while, Northern felt something shift inside him. Perhaps, I really can leave. A faint smile tugged at his lips as he stepped back, each footfall light, silent. He had other priorities now. Bigger ones. The rift shimmered, unstable, pulsing, angry. Something inside clawed at its boundary, struggling to breach. Weapons were summoned. Talents flared. The air grew dense with tension. But far above, the strange student watched Northern retreat. His eyes locked onto the boy's back, and something twisted in his expression. A shadow of rage. "I came here all the way for you," he muttered, voice a low tremor. "What do you think you're doing?" He extended his only hand, fingers trembling not from weakness, but from some volatile truth building inside. Then, lightning fell. Not around him. On him. Chapter 9:14 Old Enemy. What now? Northern couldn't help but glance back just as another pillar of lightning tore down from the sky. He pivoted sharply, a stern light flickering deep within the blue of his eyes. Everyone else also turned their attention toward the source, but in that same breath, something ripped free from the rift, shattering whatever focus they might have gathered. More people were flooding into the center of the arena now. Families, clans that had been present from the start, though none among them were noteworthy enough to steady the fear and dissonance surging through the crowd like a rising tide. Not that it was necessary. The presence of the 5 Citadel representatives managed to stitch some semblance of control over the disaster, with Silent Tenebrous standing at the center, her commands slicing sharply through the chaos. Already, 3 figures had launched themselves toward the origin of the lightning behind the rift. One an instructor, the other 2 from scattered clans. They didn't last long. Their bodies came hurtling back, crumpling across the ground, mangled and broken like discarded dolls, blood crudely splattered over what remained of their frames. One corpse, the instructor's, skidded across the dust and rolled to a stop near Northern's feet. He stared down at it with cold, detached eyes, though a small grimace began to pull at his brow. Slowly, he lifted his gaze, tracing the trajectory of their broken bodies back to the source, toward the yawning, rending mouth of the rift. The rift itself was splintering further now, massive scaled hands tearing through the thinning membrane of reality. The first creature emerged, a grotesque, elongated head reminiscent of a dragon's, but its skin gleamed unnaturally, as if hammered from molten metal, each plate overlapping like the glistening scales of a deep-sea monstrosity. Northern didn't afford it more than a glance. His mind was already leaping ahead. The people were charging toward the rift in droves, drawn either by duty or fear-driven madness, while Celis darted with sharp precision toward the rear of the rift, disappearing into the shadows beyond. Northern frowned darkly the moment she moved, and then he flashed forward, becoming a blur so swift no one even saw him go. As he crossed the rift, Celis' body reeled in the air like a lifeless doll, but he caught her, staggering 2 steps backward under the weight. He held her as she leaned against him, her breath ragged and weak. It hadn't even been 2 seconds. He had shot toward her the instant he saw her dart to the back of the rift. What in the world happened? Northern's gaze swept sharply toward the lone figure standing amidst the wreckage. At the man's feet lay a puppet, one arm missing, discarded like a broken toy. A dark light ignited deep within Northern's eyes. I see. So, he is a puppeteer after all. The man, framed by a cold white gleam in his eyes, stood tall, not with dominance, but with an eerie stillness, like one detached from the laws of presence and power altogether. His frame was slender yet honed, sharp like a blade sheathed in silk, giving him the silhouette of a noble phantom. But it was his eyes that unsettled Northern most. Narrow, intense, they burned with a stark white light. Eyes that didn't seem to blink, didn't seem to live. They resembled suns glimpsed through the ruins of a dying world, and somehow, they harmonized unsettlingly with his long, dark hair that fell past his shoulders with ceremonial neatness. Northern knew then, instinctively, all the feelings that had only been vague suspicions now snapped sharply into place. He stood on edge, tightening his hold around Celis, who was bleeding furiously from one arm. After a slow, creeping second, Northern's hoarse voice broke the silence. "Who are you?" A smile curled the man's lips. It didn't suit him. It was twisted, sinister, an expression that felt utterly out of place on a frame carved for silence and stillness. He casually dipped his hands into his pockets, leaning on one leg. A brown trench coat draped over his shoulder, flaring subtly in the furious winds swirling from the rift, perfectly framing the deep charcoal 3-piece suit he wore beneath. Their surroundings were drowned in a furious clash of roars and chaos. Yet amidst it all, his voice carried through with unsettling clarity and neatness. "I am rather disappointed that you could not recognize me at a glance, considering how many times our paths have crossed." Northern's brows tightened even further. He said, his voice edged with cold certainty, "I have never crossed paths with anyone like you." The man smiled from the corner of his mouth, a smirk that barely masked his disdain. "Oh, my little main character, you've met me quite a number of times. Not just in this incarnation. Here, in this part of the world, they call me the Prophet. And I must thank you for defeating every version of myself and helping me strive closer to completion, just as I foresaw." Northern's expression paled. From the moment the man began speaking of this part of the world, color had begun to drain from his face. There were only 2 beings who had ever left him with that kind of soul-deep trauma. 2, but he feared one far more than the other. Northern slowly parted his lips, the name surfacing against the weight of disbelief. He had thought, prayed, that he would never have to utter it again. That is impossible. Call? At last, a grin unfurled across the man's face. A grin that made his stark white eyes glint with almost boyish delight. He breathed, "Yes, son of Void, you beckon unto me." After those words, he threw back his head and unleashed a violent, grotesque, terrible laughter. one that shook his frame as he staggered and moved about, clutching his belly as if the revelation was the grandest joke of all. Northern stood rooted, a puzzled and deathly pale look carved onto his face. How is this even possible? It made no sense. There were supposed to be 3 essential parts to Call, and he had defeated all 3. He had seen them fall. He had watched them end. So what was this prophet who claimed to wear Call's name once more? Northern gritted his teeth hard enough to taste blood. And here I thought I was done with that bastard. He exhaled, a long, slow breath, and steadily forced the tremor out of his chest. Calmness, cold and cutting, began to pour back into his veins. The prophet noticed the shift. His grotesque laughter slowly died, giving way to a blank, slightly irritated expression. That other look suited your face more, he muttered. I liked the shock of realization. Northern raised the corner of his lips into a slow, glacial smile, one that radiated a pristine, savage beauty. Then he said with a soft and deadly voice, Welcome back, Call. I guess I'll be sending you to your grave again. Chapter 9:15. Praises of the Mighty One. It was an appalling realization, really, to discover that the one enemy his first hell had gifted him had simply refused to die. It was almost traumatic, but Northern felt that was all there was to it. In fact, he was rather glad Call was back, or had been lurking in the Central Plains all along. He didn't know which was the case, but his guess leaned toward the latter. There was no way Call had survived all his previous encounters. Northern was certain of that fact, as certain as the cold beneath his skin, which led him to only one conclusion: this must be the main body of Call, the true one, who had somehow slipped through the imprisonment in the Dark Continent. Whichever way it was, Northern found a grim satisfaction blooming inside him. He had been craving a test, anything to challenge the peak of his power, and now it just so happened that Call was alive. What other divine intervention could this be described as? Northern didn't like the gods, the tyrants, or the origins, but apparently they liked him a great deal. He regarded the prophet with a cold, azure glint flashing across his eyes, sharp and brittle, like light skating across a shard of broken glass. The prophet returned the glare, his gaze colder, more bone-chilling, an abyss in human shape. Then, once more, that twisted smile bloomed across his face. Then he murmured, voice scraping the air like a slow blade. You must assume you'll win again. You always have. But you see, son of Void, I began making changes before the moment you defeated me and stopped the descent of my master. In fact, it was all a part of the plan. He began to walk closer, his hands resting nobly in his pockets, every step measured with an unsettling grace. It was a difficult decision to make, but I had to destroy the organization I spent 100 years building. One meant to herald my master's return. I had to place it in the hands of a mere human, and I gave myself willingly to the government. I became a prisoner for 10 long years. Because of you. Northern frowned. To him, Call wasn't making any sense. It hadn't even been a year since he was killed. The prophet, catching the faint flicker of disbelief across Northern's face, scoffed lightly. Then he pointed 2 fingers toward his own eyes. Chaos eyes. Northern's eyes widened sharply. The prophet's grin stretched wider, dark and gleaming. Of course you would remember, he said, voice brimming with cruel satisfaction. Did you think it was mere coincidence that the rift my first incarnation occupied just happened to hold the vestige of that treacherous Chaos Prince? His tone slithered, heavy with disdain. Everything about you was perfectly molded by chaos, with only Void being the unexpected flaw in my plan. But it matters not. You will still make satisfying food for my master. The moment he descends upon your world, he will be weak, and he will feast on that seed of chaos you've been nurturing so carefully. Northern's eyes almost widened again, but his reasoning snapped into place, tempering the shock into a dark frown leveled at the prophet. Call was right about one thing. Couldn't have been a coincidence. Everything seemed to align too perfectly. The mystery surrounding the Chaos Prince's death, Call's relentless obsession with freeing his master from that fragile boundary between war and peace where he had been imprisoned. What rather baffled Northern was how Call had obtained the Chaos Eyes. He had always believed Chaos Eyes were simply an evolution, an extension of all eyes, born from the fusion of his own abilities with fragments of chaos. He thought they had manifested from his uniqueness, not as something inherited from the Chaos Prince. But now, Northern realized he had been wrong. It should have saddened him, shaken him. Instead, a strange, genuine happiness welled up inside his chest. Because if Chaos Eyes were not merely a mutation born from All Eyes, then All Eyes still existed, still lingered somewhere inside him untouched. Still, he needed to confirm it for himself. How Call had managed to possess Chaos Eyes 10 years ago while he, Northern, had only been a 6-year-old boy. Across from him, the prophet Call was growing visibly displeased. His smirk twitched, fading into something far less composed. This was supposed to be his grand moment. It had taken him 10 years to orchestrate this reunion, this unveiling. So why wasn't Northern breaking apart as he had expected? Was there something more to him that he wasn't realizing? The prophet was baffled, but doing a perfect job of suppressing it. Northern gently shifted, moving Celis off his shoulder. A clone appeared at his side, took the young woman into his arms, and flashed away from the scene. Then Northern turned fully toward Call, his focus sharpening, a slow, villainous smile curving across his face. "You look rather conflicted, Call. What's wrong?" Northern said, voice casual, almost mocking. "This isn't how you kept replaying it in your head for the past 10 years. Is it? I should be trembling in fear, paralyzed by the grand realization of your masterful plan. How you've so meticulously orchestrated this moment to turn me into food for your master." He paused, stopping just a few paces in front of the prophet. "But," his grin stretched wider, "I choose to see it a little differently." A spark of pure joy flickered in his chest as he spoke, his voice ringing with a brutal glee. "While I was only 6, some guy, somewhere, who had spent 100 years building and scheming, was already shivering at the mere possibility of my might. And then he spent another 10 years planning how to use me to free his master." His words grew sharper, every syllable a knife. "You were so pathetic you needed my help to release your master. Even after how many years of trying and failing? 100? 200? Or maybe 1,000? Northern shrugged nonchalantly, his grin deepening. "Your so-called meticulous plan, everything you've slithered and crawled through to reach this point, only sings praises of how truly fearsome and powerful I am, Call. I don't know what you're expecting from me after taking 10 whole years to reach me, especially when I've already defeated you 3 times during that span." Northern's eyes gleamed wickedly. "And I'm about to make this the 4th. The prophet and Northern stood face to face, an invisible tension crackling between them. Northern tilted his head slightly, smiling from the corner of his mouth, a smile filled with pristine malice. "And so you rendered yourself to the government. 10 years wasted in the future, foolishly crafting the path for Lieutenant Dante to cross with yours, laying out this war in the Central Plains where the people are plentiful, where the boundary of peace could be weakened, where Cryos could gain the strength to finally break free." Northern's smile thinned. "You are so damn predictable, Call." Chapter 9:16. Undefined Madness. Everything from this point wasn't difficult to piece together, and the revelation seemed less shocking the longer Northern dwelled on it. Initially, he wanted to berate himself for not suspecting something of this magnitude. But how could he have? The possibility of Call still drawing breath, let alone lurking within the Central Plains all this time, had never crossed his mind. Now that he'd uncovered Call's presence in the Central Plains, theories crystallized in his mind like frost forming on glass. He reconsidered Ruffsberg's elaborate scheme. Before, Northern had wondered how Call had become entangled in this web of intrigue. He'd dismissed Call as merely collateral damage, an unintended consequence of Ruffsberg's machinations. But now, the truth dawned on him with chilling clarity. That very plan might have existed because of Call himself. After all, Call's design had always been to foment conflict, whether among monsters or humans mattered little. The world needed to drown in bloodshed, a slaughter vast enough to tip the delicate balance between war and peace. That balance was phantasmal, a concept so ethereal that most dismissed its existence entirely. Under normal circumstances, perhaps it wouldn't matter. Northern certainly felt it shouldn't. The horrifying complication was the creature, stronger than anything humanity had ever encountered, buried within that conceptual boundary. A man, if such a being could be called one, who could obliterate the entire Central Plains with a mere thought. And so, with every battle fought, with every drop of blood spilled, the scales tilted further, the balance fractured more deeply. Contemplating such consequences, imagining what Call must have been scheming throughout these years, sent a tendril of fear through Northern's spine. The Central Plains teetered on the precipice of annihilation, an imminent devastation that could shatter everything they'd built. Despite all his power, Northern wasn't certain he could shield them all from what was coming. He fixed Call with a hardened gaze, irritation dancing across his features. Call remained unervingly silent. His face an emotionless mask after Northern had reduced his century worth of meticulous planning to nothing but futile endeavors. Not that he couldn't have simply hunted down the child of prophecy whose glimpse he'd caught a decade ago, but discovering how to harness the child's power, to channel it into his master's insatiable hunger, had filled his heart with savage delight. The origin of chaos would be immeasurably pleased with such an offering. So why settle for the simpler path? Call had never been one to extinguish potential threats prematurely, not when they promised such magnificent rewards if manipulated correctly. At last, the prophet's lips curled into a smirk as he raised his head, his hair swaying gently in the bitter wind. Around them, chaos reigned. Clashes and inhuman roars echoed across the expanse. The once grand Colosseum had metamorphosed into a theater of carnage. Humans fighting desperately against four-legged beasts that resembled wingless dragons. The creatures wielded extraordinarily spiky, elongated tails that sliced through the air with lethal precision, impaling anyone in their path. The arena bathed in blood and pandemonium while countless souls battled for mere seconds more of life. Northern's jaw tightened at the hellish tableau, acutely aware of what each death was feeding. He turned back to Call, brows knitting together as he finally broke the silence. "I have a question." A delightful smile unfurled across the prophet's face like a blooming poisonous flower. "We are not close enough for you to be asking questions." He paused, savoring the moment before adding, "Perhaps if you had shown proper fear, trembling before me, I might have considered answering, merely for the exquisite pleasure of superiority." Northern stared at him, expression vacant yet penetrating. Confusion and curiosity wrestled within him. What could drive a man to such madness? To such unreasonable extremes? The Central Plains housed 4.7 billion souls, and this man contemplated their extinction with casual indifference, all to bring back a single being. Though Northern harbored no particular attachment to humanity, a fundamental sense of proportion, something beyond mere morality, resonated within him. He respected certain boundaries, even if he wasn't bound by conventional ethics. Northern exhaled slowly. As his breath dispersed into the cold air, obsidian sparks materialized around him, dancing across his form like midnight fireflies before weaving themselves into a metallic sheen that enveloped his body. The Night Terror armor's helmet encased his features, its quartet of azure eyes igniting with a cold, piercing glow. "Remember this?" Northern's gloved fingers traced the jagged dent marring his armor's otherwise perfect surface. "This is my favorite armor, and you've scarred its beauty. This fight will be personal, Call." The prophet's eyebrows arched in mock surprise. "Oh my! Fight!" He fluttered his hands dramatically, shaking his head in exaggerated dismay. "No, no, 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 no. We shall battle most definitely, but not now. My work here is complete. However, I must leave you with a parting gift. I can't simply abandon you empty-handed. Not after you've been such a persistent thorn embedded in both my life and my carefully crafted plans." Northern's expression darkened to a vicious grimace as Call began retreating. He instinctively moved to pursue, then halted, shifting backward instead as the air before him distorted. Two figures crashed to earth between them, landing with military precision. Their eyes, cold and vacant as winter graves, fixed on Northern without blinking. Both wore identical black military uniforms. One crowned with a regulation cap pulled low, the other's wild obsidian spikes lashing against the wind like angry serpents. The grimace etched into Northern's face carved deeper as he peered beyond flesh and bone into the soul of these interlopers. Both of them were ascendants. TCH. This, undoubtedly, was the elite squad Elitis was talking about in the meeting with Paragon Rizel, the personal collection Lieutenant Dante had been cultivating for himself. The pair moved in perfect synchronization, hands extending as weapons materialized from nothingness. Northern watched from behind his armor's quartet of smoldering blue eyes, his stance shifting imperceptibly as he calculated his response. Then he pivoted, shoulders angling sideways with deliberate contempt. Like hell, I'm going to waste my time on mobs like you. His form dissolved into a streak of midnight. There, then gone, leaving only displaced air where he had stood. The two ascendants erupted into motion as one organism, the first raising a gleaming spear skyward, the second crossing twin daggers before his chest. Tendrils of sapphire and crimson light ignited around their weapons, promising devastation. Then nothing, their faces contorted with identical expressions of bewilderment. Something was terribly wrong. The familiar surge of their talent abilities failed to materialize, leaving them clutching ordinary weapons where power should have flowed. And Northern was already upon them. Chapter 917, Two Heroes. Northern had neither time nor tolerance for mobs, ascendants or otherwise. The moment he stirred, Oblivion's mark activated. Absolute lock. Unlike Jessai's conventional lock, this evolved talent operated on an entirely different principle. Northern didn't need proximity or a maintained connection. He simply cast the lock, and their talent ceased to exist. Frozen, inaccessible, unusable, until he chose otherwise. Jessai's version had conditions. It required closeness, and once the target broke that radius, their talents returned. But Absolute Lock ignored such trivialities. Distance held no bearing. Once locked, their talent remained sealed, permanently, until Northern decided to lift the shackle. As he moved, their talents withered. From his fingertips spilled ice. Slow, creeping, whispering serpents of pale frost slithering across the floor before exploding upward in jagged fury. Shards of crystalline rage erupted into the sky like frozen spears, carving through the ground with deafening force. Before the two ascendants could react, they were buried, trapped inside a spiraling prison of razor-edged ice, a mausoleum of glacial knives. Northern spared them only a glance, chill and indifferent, then vanished. Just as he disappeared, he reappeared. A four-legged, ferocious monster was seconds away from sinking its rows of jagged, cruel teeth into a helpless civilian. Illusioned Hefter rang out, a cold, hollow hymn, and cleaved through the beast's gaping maw, splitting its jaw with a clean, brutal line. Northern reached the civilian in the same motion, grabbing him by the collar and hurling him through the air. At that exact moment, one of his clones materialized, catching the old man midair before leaping out of the Colosseum. The clone darted past swarming monsters, weaving through chaos to get the man to safety. Northern was already gone, blurring to another corner of the battlefield with terrifying precision. His speed was sharp, surgical. He didn't waste a single motion. The entire Colosseum drowned in a grueling, terrible cry of battle. Screams rang out. Blood sprayed into the air in vicious arcs as monsters surged from shelter to shelter, tearing through the crowd with terrifying power. Students and civilians fell alike. Though the instructors fought, their efforts barely scratched the chaos. The students didn't even come close. The best among them, those hailed as the strongest, could do nothing more than stagger back, fending off death one shaky breath at a time. Protecting others wasn't even an option. At some point, Northern stopped. He stood still, his expression beginning to fracture. He would have loved to disperse all his clones right then, scatter them across the battlefield to ease the madness, to rescue what lives he could. But it was pointless, or so he told himself. There was nothing he could do.
No.
No. To hell with that thinking. Yes, he was weakened, drained after unmaking the hand of a Leviathan. But was that all it took to shatter his will? To make him fold? Was that the measure of his resolve? With all the power he had gained, the problem wasn't ability. It was mindset. Perhaps this was what Roma was addressing. That subtle resignation, always approaching danger with caution, always holding back, was the reason he still stumbled, the reason he hovered in mediocrity despite his overwhelming potential. There was no one, like him in the whole of the Central Plains. And if he was being honest, perhaps not in all of Trail. So why, in the middle of carnage, did he see himself as small? Northern scowled and exhaled. I have no choice, then. The air behind him shimmered, rippled like a blade tracing the edge of reality. With chaos all around, few noticed what was happening. The shimmer ruptured, tearing a quiet rift into existence. And from that small rift, two figures emerged, clad in black, lustrous armor, their movements silent yet imposing. Northern glanced at them and let out a slow, tired breath. Using the two clones meant to serve as essence cables. This will definitely be costly. Which was why he would return this clone to the limitless void, so at the very least, it could channel essence to the others. More importantly, this was a first. Northern intended to try something he'd never dared before. Not letting his clones act on their own, but fully controlling two simultaneously. This wasn't delegation. He was going to divide his consciousness between them, inhabit both bodies, control both minds, live as two at once. It sounded abrupt, but in truth it wasn't beyond him. He had simply never pushed himself this far, never stretched omniform this actively. He'd been saving it, always saving it, for a moment when everything else had failed. But now, his body was too weak to wield void, too brittle to channel chaos. And after what the prophet told him about where those powers truly came from, Northern found himself hesitating, not out of fear, but something more raw, more personal, like rejection, like shame. Still, that didn't matter now. Whatever his feelings, his current condition made it impossible to use chaos or void. His clones couldn't bear their weight either. So he would do this instead. You have changed your name. As the rift sealed behind him, one of the Northern clones dissolved its armor, the black lustrous metal cracking away like ash in a silent breeze. Then, from that same space, dark flying sparks began to spiral and cling, wrapping around the clone's form, forging a new shell. When the sparks died down, a warrior stood in molten armor, black plates veined with glowing magma. The helm was brutal, with a visor that didn't reflect light, but heat, like a volcano about to breathe. Beside him, the other clone stood the same as before. Two blue flames blazed from his eyes, 4 in total, stacked in a cruel vertical line. A sleek black tail curled from behind, coiling like a serpent. A vicious, jagged horn jutted forward, crowning it with devilish elegance. One radiated raw, monstrous strength. The other, an abyss of talents, endless, shifting, dangerous. The molten-armored Northern raised a thumbs up to the Night Terror. Night Terror returned the gesture with a crisp salute, then stumbled a bit as his body trembled. He caught himself almost instantly, steadying his frame with a soft laugh. This is definitely going to take a while. They both spoke the line at the same time, voices overlapping in eerie unison. The Northern in molten armor sighed and gently slapped his own forehead. He had meant for only Night Terror to say that. But now, Northern was beginning to see it clearly. It was possible. Because of Omniform, he could divide his consciousness with startling ease. Slip into another body like shifting into a different stance. It wasn't just theory anymore. The only real challenge was getting used to it. Wait, could I actually control all of them? Every clone? Thousands. Simultaneously. It sounded impossible, felt impossible. Yet something deep in his core whispered otherwise. It wasn't just wishful thinking, it was intuition. A quiet truth waiting to be proven. It wasn't a question of possibility. It was a question of readiness. He wasn't there yet. But someday, for now, that dream could wait. Right now, people were dying. And the two Northerns had work to do. The Night Terror waited. Meanwhile, Molten Northern launched into the air, the sheer force of his ascent shattering the ground beneath him. The Colosseum trembled as he rose, and when he came crashing down, a thunderous impact tore through the arena. Stone erupted. Chunks of marble and steel launched into the air, crashing down like meteors. Northern didn't pause. He was already moving, wielding the warhammer he had taken from Nasira. It swung with ruinous momentum, tearing through monsters like paper and hurling their bodies aside as though they were weightless. But the shockwaves that followed told a different story. Those creatures were heavy, densely built, brutal in form. The hammer's devastation wasn't due to light enemies. It was proof of the overwhelming strength of its wielder. Then Night Terror Northern moved. He didn't leap. He vanished, a blur of motion, a conceptual flash like speed itself had taken form. He appeared beside a hulking beast in an instant. No warning.
No noise.
Just presence. His hand snapped forward, gripping the monster's head. Frost bloomed at the point of contact, webbing outward like veins of ice, burrowing into the creature's skull. In less than a second, the beast became a statue of frozen horror. Night Terror cloaked his hands in roaring blue flames, flames that rose like a pillar, licking the sky with violent grace. And then he punched. The impact exploded with a shriek of fury. The flames surged forward in a cataclysmic blast, reducing the creature not just to cinders, but to nothing. But the fire didn't stop there. It raced forward, devouring every monster in its path. A flood of blue inferno swallowed the battlefield, unstoppable, cleansing. And yet, strangely, within the storm, the students felt safe. As the inferno died down, the results were clear. Every student, civilian, drifter were still standing. Every monster, burnt to ash. The students and civilians stared at the figure who had saved them. They recognized him, of course, how could they not? They had seen a similar power unleashed during the duel. Now, seeing it again in the midst of chaos, their eyes lit with gratitude, and their hearts surged with hope. But Night Terror Northern paid their gazes no mind. In truth, he disliked the look in their eyes, the awe, the admiration. It made his skin crawl, so he simply turned away and focused on what mattered: fighting. Elsewhere on the battlefield, the scene was much the same. As more instructors, students, and civilians were rescued by the fearsome figure in molten armor, their fear slowly gave way to awe. Watching him crush the monsters with thunderous might, they couldn't help but admire the terrifying, unstoppable force that now fought on their side. To them, he wasn't just a drifter. He was a hero. Chapter 918. The enigmatic heroic paragon. Clad in vicious black armor with thick metallic overlapping plates, their crudely jagged edges absorbing the beautiful day's light, Northern moved like a fearsome wind of darkness. The hammer added a tremendous note of grotesque strength to his form, lending him a twisted, dark gracefulness that seemed almost blasphemous in its perfection. He spared no one glances, nor did he waste precious moments on the monsters he slayed. They were merely obstacles, unworthy of his full attention. He materialized abruptly before a monster, his hammer taking a terrifying upward swing. The weapon crushed the beast's jaw with a sickening crunch, sending purple viscous liquid arcing through the air like unholy rain. The hammer was already carving another cruel arc, descending with merciless precision to pound the monster's head into the ground. Webbed cracks spread instantaneously across the concrete, fracturing without warning beneath the devastating impact. Northern pivoted the hammer, impaling one of the creature's eyes with the razor-sharp end of its shaft. The four-legged monstrosity let out a guttural growl, thick and vibrative, a sound that matched the savage nature of its appearance. Northern drove the hammer shaft deeper, piercing through the eye socket and out through the jaw below. He paid no mind to the brutal spray of blood staining his armor, which, eerily, evaporated almost immediately upon contact. Nor did he flinch at the beast's fearsome cry that made the very ground tremble beneath them. Northern was cold, wicked, devastating. The monster's tail lashed at him, violently tearing through the air. But Northern ignored it completely, trusting his armor's defense enough not to waste even a glance on such a trivial attack. The tail bounced off the molten vein armor with a shower of fiery sparks that flared briefly before dying out, unable to ignite against the supernatural metal. With colossal might, Northern wrenched out the shaft of his hammer. A torrent of gore erupted into the air, painting everything in its path with death's signature. The monster growled terribly, its voice cracking under the strain of agony. It thrashed wildly now, infected with the madness born from unbearable pain. Its tail whipped forward repeatedly, but each attempt met only the formidable metal forged in the depths of molten magma. Eventually, Northern snatched the tail mid-strike, wrapping it around his hands like flexible wire, though they were clearly coiled muscles, powerful and strong. But before his might, they might as well have been thread. He stepped back and hoisted the monster by its tail, slamming it against the ground. The impact sent fractures racing across the fine but brutally stained concrete. He pivoted and slammed the beast again before rolling his shoulder and launching it skyward. The monster hurtled into the clouds and beyond, vanishing into the vast emptiness of space like a shooting star in reverse, a fleeting testament to Northern's terrible power. He was already flowing toward the next monster, a seamless transition, like shadow becoming motion. The creature charged at him with ferocious strength, claws outstretched for the kill. Northern stomped one leg on the ground, his foot crushing into concrete and sending shrapnel of stone spraying into the air. His hand moved with blurring speed, fingers flicking each fragment with imperceptible precision. To any observer, it appeared only as invisible projectiles piercing into the creature's eyes, causing it to stumble mid-stride and roll helplessly toward Northern. Of course, he wasted no such sweet opportunity. Grinning grimly behind the visor of molten vein, charged with thunderous electricity, he brought down the hammer. The impact released a shockwave that rippled outward in a cloud of dust and broken earth. The entire battlefield trembled and everyone seemed to pause for a heartbeat. Even the representatives of the citadels, each locked in their own desperate battles, all froze momentarily. Each of these monsters was at least a maelstrom. There was no way a random stranger could be defeating Maelstrom with mere swings of some enormous hammer. Unless, Vector's eyes widened. He scratched his golden hair as he tried to comprehend the idea forming in his mind. The creature that had perched atop his head was gone. In its place stood a ferocious yellow beast with black stripes rippling across its muscled body. Its eyes burned with rage, making that innocent look from before seem like a cruel deception. A paragon? The words escaped his lips in a whisper of realization. Even amidst the battle, the young representative of the Verilian Citadel maintained his nonchalance, seemingly disconnected from the chaos surrounding him. But he staggered forward as he stared, transfixed, at Northern, the tail of a monster sweeping over his head where it had been mere fractions of seconds ago. Instantly, his beast leaped onto the monster, both creatures locked in a fearsome struggle for dominance as they tumbled across the broken ground. A paragon is fighting amidst us? Damn! We are saved. The words erupted from Vector, a rare display of emotion breaking through his facade. As he shouted, the traditional swordsman representing Nithra's citadel happened to land nearby, reeling from the terrible force of a monster's blow. He glanced at Vector, eyes narrowing. "Did you say a paragon is here?" His brows curved into a dark, serious frown. Then he followed Vector's gaze, watching the stranger in dark molten armor as he fought with unbelievable ease, crushing monsters like he was playing some macabre game of whack-a-mole. His expression paled as he witnessed the entire ground tremble when the armored figure hefted the hammer and whacked a monster like a golf ball, sending it sailing into the distance. Dear stars! Such strength! But wasn't that hammer? The words died on his lips, confusion etching itself across his face. The last person he had seen wielding that hammer was the strange, non-combative student, the very reason he had been forced to come to Milwa Festival and in extension, participate in this conflict. And speaking of the student, he was over there, in his black lustrous armor, his path marked by vicious, jagged formations of ice that jutted upward and impaled monsters with cold ferocity. He was holding a sword, the same blade everyone recognized as his signature weapon. He moved with uncanny speed, seemingly impossible to sense or track. The swordsman found it difficult to keep his eyes on the student because he was perpetually in motion, never stopping, his blade always singing, albeit with an emotionless melody that harvested death with each swing. That was Northern. This armored figure had to be a strange paragon who had happened to claim the hammer and was now wielding it with devastating effect. Indeed, they were all going to be saved today. Their fates were not as bleak as they had seemed, as long as a paragon stood among them. This was how the tale of the enigmatic heroic paragon began. Chapter 919. Failing Defenses. Across the battlefield, a cacophony of fire and ice unfolded, a spectacle that left onlookers bewildered. The flames danced with life, soaring through the air like sentient wings, riding the wind's fury while igniting everything in their path with explosive blazes. No monster escaped the onslaught. Flaming arrows wove through the sky before raining down, skewering monsters with brutal precision. The beasts staggered, crumbled, then erupted into wicked, immolating infernos. The chaos left no room for others to act. By cruel coincidence, this area teemed with more students and civilians than drifters. When the rift tore open, many leaders had leapt to the main arena out of pure instinct, the monsters overwhelming their defenses. While Northern confronted the prophet, the beasts broke through the student line and unleashed havoc. Drifters, civilians, students, all fell to the slaughter, until the unassuming non-combative student stormed the battlefield wielding his remarkable ice and fire talents. His speed defied belief. He materialized exactly when needed, just in time to deflect a killing blow meant for a young woman. Quick enough to drive his foot into another monster's flank as it prepared to sink its hideous fangs into two female students who clung to each other, their screams piercing the air. Without sparing them a glance, he flowed to the next threat. His thin silvery blade cut through the air, almost harmonizing with the soft-colored atmosphere. The sound of his sword, cold, ruthless, yet eerily silent. A monster crushed a drifter's defense with its massive tail, sending the fighter flying backward before recoiling to strike again. Then Northern burst into the fray. He tossed his sword skyward. The steel twirled in the air before he snatched it back in reverse grip, carving across the monster's hide with a meticulously practiced, pivoting dance. He pivoted again, his hands flowing like silken banners in the wind, tearing a vicious laceration across the creature's flank. With a twist of his grip on the illusion hefter, he buried the blade deep inside the beast. Black flames. Merciless obsidian flames erupted, devouring the monster whole. It had no chance to struggle before the flames silenced it with a cruel, final death. Northern was already moving again. The four burning blue eyes of his helm flared with devilish coldness, sending chills down the spines of those who met his gaze, freezing them in place. Monsters roared more ferociously at his approach, whipping themselves into a frenzy as he wove between them. As he advanced, terrifying blades of wind accompanied him, slicing through flesh without announcing their presence. Beneath his feet, his shadow transformed into something darker, a singularity of pure darkness with a life of its own. Black jagged spikes erupted from the shadows, impaling monsters in all directions. Both those he engaged directly and those beyond his immediate reach fell to these shadowy weapons. This devastating area attack thinned the monster's ranks regardless of who faced them. It bought Northern precious seconds before he reached each new threat. For the fleeing civilians, it granted vital moments to escape the ferocious maelstrom. The Colosseum, with his arrival, regained some semblance of order. The monsters now fixated on him, charging toward his position, as if commanded to eliminate the most dangerous threat on the battlefield. The pressure mounted around Northern, exactly as he intended. With the beasts focusing their fury on him, the mundane humans and students found paths to safety. He felt a flicker of relief seeing instructors already rounding up survivors, guiding them out of the Colosseum. Yet the monster's numbers only swelled. Even as he bathed his surroundings in generous waves of flame, the creatures responded with heightened frenzy, charging headlong into the inferno if it meant breaching the fiery barrier to reach him. The sheer volume of monsters surging toward him made even their crude attacks dangerous enough to demand his full attention. But that wasn't his only challenge, nor the most pressing one. The real problem lay in maintaining control over both clones. When the battlefield remained spacious with scattered enemies, movement came easily. Now, with monsters executing a pincer attack and an overwhelming throng focusing solely on him, the delicate balance of his control began to slip insidiously from his grasp. Frustration mounted within him. A slight misstep here, a faltering movement there, causing his sword to miss its mark. His only reliable ally became the ferocious, immolating flames. Yet even those proved insufficient as monster after monster tore through the firewall with terrifying power, like arrows of vicious jagged fangs propelled by rippling scaled muscles, punching through his defenses. He strained to move, struggling to execute attacks as they formed in his mind. Focus slipped away like water through fingers, fueling his frustration and further destroying what little control remained. The consequences manifested in both locations. The two Northerns faltered, losing ground to the relentless monsters. Meanwhile, the horde grew more enormous, pouring through the rift like a dam burst, flooding across the entire Colosseum. The one silver lining. The people now filling the arena were drifters from clans and the academy, all engaged in desperate combat. The grim reality. They were hopelessly outnumbered. Nothing awaited them but utter, devastating annihilation. Not even the enigmatic heroic Paragon could save them from this calamity. Yet the Paragon himself showed no signs of struggle. His strength remained terrifying, enormously powerful. His punches pulverized monsters, leaving nothing but exploding flesh in their wake. When he smashed his leg against the ground, the floor quaked and erupted with massive stone debris. Monsters stumbled, their footing lost in the chaos. This bought the defenders a moment's reprieve, but only a moment. The battle lines crumbled under the sheer weight of monsters, and worse, the Paragon began to stagger. Sometimes he appeared dizzy, disoriented. Other times he froze mid-action, standing like a statue, like death itself had claimed him while still on his feet. Those watching could tell something was terribly wrong. Each of these worrying signs hammered another nail into the coffin of the defenders' already fragile morale. Northern grimaced beneath the night terror visor. "All right, let's move things up a bit." Chapter 920. Creator of Carnage. Struggling to maintain control over both clones' consciousness, Northern felt the vice of pressure tightening around his mind. He needed to act now. This was his first attempt at being two different people simultaneously, each acting differently while facing overwhelming odds. The strain clawed at his focus, threatening to snap it in two. Only one option remained. On the enigmatic Paragon's side, Northern stretched forth his void force, letting it envelop him like a round wall. The molten vein Northern stood surrounded by an invisible barrier that kept the thrashing monsters at bay. They lunged with demented frenzy, climbing and tearing at each other with no regard for their own kind. Their eyes burned with a single furious resolve: kill the man standing in their midst. The invisible wall only seemed to stoke their rage further, their howls rising to a fever pitch. With his other consciousness now secured in a stationary position, Northern focused on Night Terror Northern. He couldn't still resort to chaos or void, so he would push his talent further, raising the bar on what he could accomplish. Northern exhaled, a whisper of breath escaping his lips as he battled the creatures. His blade sliced through the air, though the path before him remained so cluttered and confined that his style couldn't flow freely. The blade felt like an extension of his arm, singing its deadly melody despite the chaos surrounding him. Beneath his feet, darkness pooled like spilled ink. This wasn't his shadow. It was the unique manifestation of eclipsing dread, a shadow divorced from nature, existing solely for itself and by itself, a lone sentinel of darkness. The shadow thickened and rippled like liquid midnight, spreading outward beneath the rushing monsters, filling their shadows and reaching ever wider. As it expanded, Northern's spatial awareness deepened like roots growing into fertile soil. The eclipsing dread seemed to function as a carrier of perception, enhancing his natural senses beyond their limits. This newfound awareness painted a clearer picture of the battlefield and the staggering odds stacked against him. Since Eclipse Dread was only recently copied, and from a mere master at that, Northern's options were limited. Even enriched with Void Essence, the abilities still lacked the potency he desired. The shadow's radius, for instance, could only stretch so far. Though he'd covered a significant number of raging monsters, less than half of those plaguing his side of the Colosseum had been ensnared in his darkness. The floor cracked and splintered beneath their monstrous strength, each thunderous stomp sending tremors through the ground. Every effort to contain them only seemed to fuel their resolve, like trying to douse a fire with oil. Northern had always despised rifts teeming with overwhelming numbers. The Tier 9 rift they just completed had featured plenty of monsters, but compared to this chaos, that number suddenly seemed trivial. Yet the Tier 9 rift had presented a different challenge. Those monsters had been incredibly difficult to kill. Northern doubted any drifter aside from himself and Paragon Rizel had managed to slay even one. These creatures, despite being Maelstrom ranks, were relatively easier to dispatch. Even so, easier was a dangerous word here. Others were clearly struggling, their faces etched with strain as they fought for survival in this arena of death. If any group stood apart from the struggling masses, it was the Citadel representatives. Their coordination flowed like water. One fighter would engage a maelstrom just long enough for another to join the fray, and when two proved insufficient, a third would seamlessly slide in to deliver the killing blow. Their method cut through the chaos with surgical precision. They understood not only the urgency that pressed upon them but also the boundaries of their own strength, a rare and valuable quality in battle. Northern couldn't help but admire them, their discipline burning bright amid the mayhem. Even Helena carved her own path through the monsters, a force of nature unto herself. With her black rod discharging shadowy sparks, she danced through the crowd of beasts, never still for more than a heartbeat. The raw power behind her movements spoke volumes about the gulf between her and the others. Despite her small stature and seemingly fragile frame, each step she took cracked the ground beneath her feet, and her strikes sent monsters twice her size reeling backward as though hit by a battering ram. The monsters' tendency to pool toward a single target worked to the fighter's advantage, allowing them to focus their efforts without becoming overwhelmed. Even so, concern for the heroic Paragon caught in the middle flashed across their faces between strikes. With their combined strength, they were making headway. The difference might be small, but Northern appreciated every monster that fell to their blades. He whispered, his voice barely audible above the cacophony of battle. "Okay now." From the pooling shadows beneath, Northern reached into the darkness as if dipping into a well and began to pull something forth. But this ice defied nature's design. Obsidian black and glassy, it glittered with a malevolent violet light that seemed to drink in the surrounding illumination rather than reflect it. He drew the first shard from the embrace of darkness and, with a flick of his wrist, impaled the nearest monster through its jaw. The ice erupted from the top of its skull in a grotesque fountain of frozen cruelty. The creature froze in place, its movements slowing to a crawl. Though the arena still thundered with the chaotic symphony of combat, this single monster stood out in Northern's field of vision, a canvas for what was to come. The ice trembled, then transformed. Branches of black crystal snaked through the monster's throat with terrible speed, spreading not just through its gullet, but throughout its entire body like a parasitic network. The frozen tendrils burst through scaled skin from within, lifting the beast into the air, a grotesque trophy announcing the dread about to unfold. Behind the helm of his Knight Terror armor, Northern's lips curled into a devilish grin, teeth gleaming in the violet light of his creation. "It's a success." No sooner had the words echoed through his mind than a terrifying tremor ripped through the arena. The shadows erupted, birthing an explosion of obsidian ice that plunged into the surrounding monsters with merciless precision. A lightning-fast network of crystalline spears spread like a plague, never pausing, never hesitating. From their origin point in the shadows, they branched outward, tearing through flesh and bone as if they were paper. Each jagged shard linked to another, creating a web of death that expanded with blistering speed. In a single heartbeat, an eerie silence smothered the section of the arena where Night Terror Northern stood. The sounds from elsewhere still continued but seemed distant now, muffled by the sudden absence of monster shrieks and battle cries in his immediate vicinity. The burning blue flames of his visor blazed like radiant stars for a moment as he slowly lifted his gaze to survey his handiwork. Everything stood frozen in time. All movement had ceased, the monsters transfixed in their final moments, impaled wickedly in various contortions by the network of ice spikes that gleamed with malevolent beauty under the arena's harsh light. The tableau before him was macabre enough to make the likes of Roma turn pale, retch, and empty the contents of her stomach. Northern himself had been in such position before, once, but now he merely stared, his gaze filled with a cold emptiness that matched the frozen wasteland he'd created. The blood-chilling carnage surrounding him was his doing, his creation,